This is Matt Brown, and you're listening to Just a Good Conversation. A kindergarten teacher will ask her students, what do you want to be when you grow up? Many of those students will say, I want to be a police officer. Paul Pantani wanted to be a lawyer as a young boy. But who knew his career path would be found in his neighbor's trash can?
Junior high, we had a former LAPD officer living next door to us. So this is, at this time, we're talking early 80s, probably like 81, 82. I remember finding in the trash that he was throwing out these old cassettes. And so I started listening to him, and what it was him dictating his reports. So the secretary would listen to it, they would type the report, but he was dictating his investigations. And I mean, it was just a generic shoebox, and so there's probably 13 or 14 of these old cases, and I remember listening to them all and saying, that's what I want to do. So going into high school, I knew that I wanted to be a police officer.
I'm Matt Brown, host of Just a Good Conversation. Take a listen to our archives. My guests have ranged from fashion designers, principals, Hall of Fame basketball players, Silver Star recipients, and small business owner John Benton.
It was like all the other cars were like I was dating. And maybe that's a puppy love here and there. But I fell in love with that car. It did everything I wanted to do. And once I got it sorted, it just would do it without failure.
Right.
I ran a lot of cars to failure and a lot of different things to failure. I just really liked that combination.
The rest of my conversation with John can be found on our archives at justagoodconversation.com. Let's take a quick break for my sponsor before diving into my conversation with Paul Pantani. I have to say, probably the safest podcast I'm going to do right now. I'm sitting here with an officer. How are you, Paul?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
I'm great. I mean, I feel like if something goes down, I'm protected.
You're protected, and actually, we're here in Temecula, so you're in a very safe portion of Riverside County. It's probably one of the nicer cities.
I remember as a wee lad, my dad would take, I don't know why, he hated going down to San Diego because he always liked, there's 2 ways in and 2 ways out, and it always was congested. But when we would come down the 15, you'd go, oh, there's Lake Elsinore. And then there's San Diego. There was nothing else. It was just nothing.
Well, you could go flip side, and now today, everybody enjoys living here, and this whole area around the 15, between Lake Elsinore and San Diego, has become more congested, I'll say.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't matter what time of the day, what day of the week. My friend came out from South Carolina because he was one of the groomsmen in my wedding. And we got on the freeway at one point on a Saturday afternoon at about 6 o'clock. And he's like, this is more traffic than we have around my house on a Tuesday during rush hour.
Isn't it crazy? Like, we don't have a slow period anymore on traffic.
No.
Right. And you've done law enforcement in LA. Like, you're not like from South Carolina law enforcement. There's no like, oh, it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday. We'll get through. All the Orthodox Jews aren't driving today. No, it doesn't matter. Everybody's on the road.
I remember, this is probably 10 years ago now, so all 3 of my kids were playing sports at that time. My 2 girls were playing softball, and my son was playing baseball, and they were playing in Corona. We left the softball field. It's Saturday, 10 o'clock, and I had to get my son to his game on the other side of Corona. Went over the 91 freeway at 10, 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and both sides of the 91 were completely bumper to bumper. I tell people all the time, you live in Temecula and you're a Dodger fan, going to Dodger Stadium is virtually impossible.
Oh, no. You stay the night before you get a hotel because the stress factor of making that drive. I mean, I see you got your Dodger shirt on. I got my water cup. I mean, how is that drive coming home? Holy Christ, everybody must be asleep.
Well, fortunately, my in-laws are in the valley, so generally what we will do is we'll stay the night there and then drive in the morning. But if you're talking a midweek game and you got to go to work the next day?
Not a chance in hell.
No.
I don't care who's pitching.
No.
Oh, Jesus. Were you the little boy when everybody was in like 2nd grade and they're like, what does everybody want to be? And somebody would say, I want to be an astronaut and I want to be a fireman. Did you immediately raise your hand and say, I wanted to be a policeman?
Not in second grade. In second grade, and probably up through, I would say maybe junior high, I had these visions of maybe being a lawyer.
A lawyer?
A lawyer.
Nobody in second grade says lawyer. You were that kid?
I was that kid.
What were you watching? Law and Order? What the hell?
Well, no, we're a lot older than that. We're a lot older. Perry Mason.
Perry Mason. Like, what was the lawyer in you at 7?
I'll say the same thing. What was the cop in me? Neither one of those things are in my family.
Cops are way cooler, though. They got a car. Lawyers? Like, you know the lawyer joke. Come on.
I do know the lawyer joke. And the thing is that it just, I don't know where it came from. That was kind of bouncing around my head. I was like every other young kid. I thought I was going to play for the Dodgers. So, you know.
Were you a good debater as a young kid? Like, did you want to, like.
I was good at getting in trouble and trying to talk my way out of it.
Okay. All right.
But it didn't always, it rarely worked.
So you weren't a great lawyer.
No. My closing arguments would have been horrible.
But Dad, really?
Yeah. Don't look at my stats as a lawyer, as a client. Like, I'll do my best.
So somehow by the time you get to junior high, there's a switch where you're like, not lawyer, maybe another career, path for me.
Yeah, and I can tell you exactly when it
Dodgers.
happened. Yeah, I was gonna play for the Dodgers. Junior high, we had a former LAPD officer living next door to us, and so this is at this time we're talking early '80s, probably like 81, 82.
Wow. Okay.
And I remember finding in the trash that he was throwing out these old cassettes. And so I started listening to him, and what it was him dictating his reports. So the secretary would listen to it, and they would type the report, but he was dictating his investigations.
Wow.
And, I mean, it was just a generic shoebox, and so there was probably 13 or 14 of these old cases, and I remember listening to them all and saying, that's what I want to do. So going into high school, I knew that I wanted to be a police officer.
Whoa. Jesus, that could have been really interesting what you could have like listened to and realized like if he was a detective and he's going over like god awful cases or whatever, the Night Stalker, whoever was hot in 81. Holy moly.
I couldn't tell you right now to this day of what I remember listening to. It
just sounded cool.
Yeah. Just
especially I'm sure the way he was kind of dictating it.
I interviewed so-and-so and they said this, and then from there my partner and I, and it was just the dictation of an investigation. And the funny thing is fast forward, I remember as a police officer myself dictating the same things to our secretaries.
That's awesome. So does your high school counselor, when they sit down with you and you say, I think I want to do law enforcement, does she look at you kind of sideways, or where was there kind of then a next step? What was your thought process?
So my time with my counselor in high school was never good. I grew up in Baldwin Park, not the most safest city. And fortunately for me, my father, being very strict, was, you're not going to go to Baldwin Park High School. I'm going to find the way to afford to send you to Bishop Almont, which is a Catholic private school.
Yep, I know that one.
Had to take an entrance exam to get into this high school. Scored very high in all the categories. But by 13 or 14 years old, it was a culmination effect. I was now butting heads all the time with my dad. I had hit a growth spurt, and I wanted to transition from playing baseball to playing football, which my dad hated. My dad was from Brooklyn. Baseball was in his blood,
yes.
And so when I told him that I didn't want to play baseball anymore, you'd have thought I'd cut out part of his, liver. And so we were just constantly butting heads. Then I had this transition from growing up, going to public school, to now going to a private Catholic school. All the rules. Most of the people that I knew, my friends, didn't go there. So it's like you're going into a new environment, not really knowing anybody. And so...
all boys too, right?
Not at that time.
Okay.
By that time, it was co-ed.
Okay.
And not to the old school strict of the girls had to be on their knees and the tape measure with the how short the skirt had to be, but they were pushing the limits. But it was still, for the most part, very strict. And with all of that going on, I just align myself with a group of people that was more interested in drinking, not necessarily doing schoolwork, you know, never anything to the point that, I say this now, I mean, we could have potentially gotten arrested for some things, but basically just being knuckleheads.
Yeah, being stupid stuff.
And in my mind at 13, 14, 15 years old, thinking, I'm getting back at my dad, I'm showing him. But, you know, you're just, in hindsight, looking back, you're like, you're not getting it at anybody. I wish somebody would have just, other than my dad, because there was no way I was listening to him.
Right.
Somebody would have pulled me aside and go, can you pull your head out of your ass?
Yeah. Did you have older brother or sister? No.
I'm an only child.
Only child.
Only child.
So you didn't have anybody slap you on the back of the head and say like, dude, Paul,
no,
let's go.
Now, fortunately, you talk about a guidance counselor. Senior year of high school. Start senior year with a 1.97 GPA. Guidance counselor calls me in, and I wish to this day I remembered her name, but she was the first one who talked to me the way it needed to be talked to, and basically said, so what branch of the service are you going into? Because you're not going to do anything else with your life. And unless you pull your head out of your ass, you're pretty much not going to succeed in anything. And just that, turning that corner, pulled A's and B's in my senior year just because I applied myself and was able to finally, you know, I was able to get out of there with like a 2.3. But as much of a knucklehead as I was, as much as my social circle was not pro law enforcement, if you would have asked me what I wanted to do, I still wanted to be a police officer.
Really? What was the draw? What was it? That's a hook. I mean, Dodgers, yeah, that's cool. It's sexy. You got a uniform and there's chicks and money and you play in Dodger Stadium.
I think at the end of the day, it was my dad's respect.
Okay.
My dad wasn't somebody who liked the police. He wasn't somebody who ever touted them, but at the same token, he respected them.
Okay.
And I still remember one time, I want to say it might have been my junior year of high school, they sent home the slip of, hey, have your parents sign this that the police can search lockers anytime they want.
I remember that, yeah.
And I remember making a joke, like, can you believe the school wants to let the police search my locker anytime they want? I remember my dad going, why can't they? You know, if somebody has to search your locker, open the damn thing up or I'll come down there and I'll, you know, basically it was like, it was that moment of, oh, wow, he actually does respect police.
Yeah.
And so I think that was probably the final nail that just drove it home. Like, okay, and you look at the psychology of it. I'm sure part of it I was looking for his respect. Even though we were butting heads, I was looking for his respect.
Yeah. It's, I've had a lot of officers in and out of my life, especially with journalism. You're always running into cops that you would see at like the SC game or the Laker game or Dodger game. And then you'd see them at just random events, and you would, you know, what, LA probably has, 9,000, almost 10,000 officers, and it seemed like I saw the same 25. You know, we got old and together and grayer, and mustaches got, you know, grayer. And then I always thought like, wow, like that is such a commitment. And yeah, I've talked to them. We have, you know, one in our family who flies helicopters for Anaheim and stuff. And it's like, I don't think that was, to me, that was never on my radar as a kid. Like, yeah, I wanted to be the next O.J. Simpson or be Fernando or whatever. But I never said like, law enforcement. Now, I did think military. And that's really there's a fine line between the two, right? It's just one does a little less and one does a little more. And I just thought like, I could do the military. That would be cool. I'd love to be an Army man, drive a tank. And then I see Daryl Gates show up with his cool battering ram. And I was like, wait a minute.
That's kind of like a tank.
That's kind of like a tank. Holy shit. Daryl Gates has a tank. And then I remember thinking, well, I could drive that LAPD bright blue tank around. That would be hot. It was so funny as kids. Like, that's what it came down to. Like, I saw the other day, the sheriffs dropped their helicopter in the middle of like Wilshire or something for some event. And I was like, look at that thing. That thing is pimped out. It's all green and gold. And I was like, damn, they didn't just go with the basic black. Someone like designed that and was like, yeah, we're sheriffs. We're going bold. I want gold across that thing. And
I want people to know I'm here.
Yeah, not just green with flakes of green on it. Yeah, sheriffs. It's like, shit, like, where was that when I was a kid? That was never a hot rod. The cop car was always like dull and plain, and the Dukes of Hazzard car was always like cool. And it's like, was there a moment for you where you were just kind of like, yep, that's me. I'm going in. I'm going to walking, like they don't have recruiters like they do at the mall or something. But what was that step for you to go like, I'm in, I'm going to walk up and I'm recruiting this guy?
So you mentioned the military. My dad served. He was in the Army. He was actually a tank commander in Korea. And
in Korea, whoa.
yeah, he's an old guy.
Yeah,
I'm
but
old
that's
too,
cool. But that's the war no one really talks about. It's kind of like we goes from World War II to Vietnam, and everybody forgets about Korea.
Very true.
Hell. Oh.
And he never talked negatively about his time. It was never something that was. He never talked about wanting to make a career out of it. He did his enlistment and then got out.
Right.
But he always talked fondly of serving this country. My dad actually wasn't born here. My dad was born in Italy and came here as a young boy. And so he was through and through, America's the greatest place. You do everything you can to protect her, so he was proud to have served. And so when I was coming towards the end of high school, and like I said, I knew I wanted to be a cop, but I also knew that I had this gap. I had to fill between 18 to 21 till I could be a cop.
Right.
So I went down the military route. I started looking at the military. And I've told other people this also goes to my naiveness in that I didn't do enough of my own research. My dad was like, hey, you want to go in the military? I came close to doing the delayed enlistment. And then right at the very end, when he was going to have to sign, he's like, when you're 18, you sign and go in the military. I'm not going to sign for you. And so between 17 and a half and 18, I talked to whoever I came in contact who had been in the military. But I knew that I only wanted to do that 3 or 4 years so that I could come out and be a cop.
Okay.
And the advice that I was given was, unless you're going to make a career out of it, you're not going to get much out of it. They're going to promise you the world. The recruiters are going to sell you on it. But when you get there, hey, I thought I was going to be doing this. Yeah, we need tires changed in the motor pool kind of deal. And so to my detriment, I didn't go further. I started basically looking in the window, but never really said, let me look into this and see what I can do and what would be available for me. And so I didn't do that route. I had a friend of mine who was a police cadet, and I went, that sounds like a cool job. And so I started applying at some local PDs that had cadets and ended up getting hired. So basically at 19 years old, I walked in the door of law enforcement and never looked back. If
you could do it over, would you do that military route, then go to police?
Yes, 100%. There's that little part of me, especially after 9/11 happened, that you just feel like, did I do enough? And I firmly believe this. The role that the military plays is huge, but the men and women who are putting their lives on the line every day to keep the country safe here at home are just as important. So I have zero regrets going down the law enforcement route, but there's that little part of me that just kind of goes, what if? And I have friends who just did their 4 years and got out, but it's something that they always are, especially, talk to a Marine, talk to a Marine who only did one enlistment, 4 years. It still completely changed their life. And you could talk to them 50 years later and it's still a piece of their overall puzzle.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do regret it.
My oldest brother was in the Navy, and he was my cool older brother before he went in with his OPE pro shorts and a skateboard and his big wavy Van Halen hair. But then when he went into the Navy, he got a little heavier. Obviously his head was shaved, but then he was always like a seal in the water, a dolphin. He could swim forever. And he went into sea rescue, and he was on an aircraft carrier. And when he came back, I was like, dude, you're not my brother anymore. You're like a total badass. You're like, whoa. He's like, yeah, I'm jumping off helicopters. I'm saving pilots that are idiots and he had all these cool stories. We're in Korea. And I was like, dude, you're awesome. You're like my G.I. Joe. You're totally and it was such a weird thing to my grandfather was in World War II. My uncle was a Marine, Vietnam, but it's when it was my brother, it was whoa, that's cool. So yeah, there was especially you said September 11th, how many times that really changed people? You got Pat Tillman's that legendary story, he leaves an NFL career. There's a lot of people that decided, I'm in. And it's something interesting like that to happen to our country, that people go, yeah, I'm in. I'm re-enlisting or I'm going in. Wow, that's unbelievable.
It was a huge pivotal moment for our society, and I do believe that. And I think for those of us who grew up, you and I together, post-Vietnam, pre-Gulf War, the military was always something that was there, but we really didn't know about it. We knew, hey, there was John Rambo, and he was this real badass. But for the most part, we didn't realize how much opportunity was afforded to us by going into the military. You could do virtually anything under the sun. They are a Fortune 500 company, and they have all aspects of it. And so,
especially today.
But what I've also told people is, for those of us who grew up in that time period, the 70s and the 80s, there was always that reverence for Pearl Harbor and D-Day.
Yes.
Such a pivotal moment for our country. And you know, those who have been, you know, go see the USS Arizona in Hawaii. And then we got too old. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happens. And it's that reminder of, did we do everything we could do for this country? Oh man, I'm too old to, you know, to go. And not necessarily that too old, but now I've got a family, now I've got this, you know, kind of deal. And so I think that drives a little bit of that, God, I wish I would have. But now we're getting to a point where 9/11's, that enough times passed, that kids are now looking at 9/11 the way we grew up looking at Pearl Harbor. It was something that happened in our history, but they've got no connection to it.
They heard about it.
It's in a history book.
Right. They've seen photos, but they've seen the black and white of the, you know, Arizona going down. They've seen the towers in a movie.
Yes.
They'll watch Friends or Godfather or whatever, and there's the towers in it. And they're like, oh, is that what you're referencing? It's like, yeah, that's the building.
And the other thing that really drove it home for me, so I was born in New York. And even though my mom was from California, and when I was young, she wanted to come back to California. My dad was working for American Airlines at that point in time. He was like, I don't have to fuel airplanes in the snow. Let's go to California. And for me growing up, though, there's something to this day. I go back to New York City, it feels like home. There's just something that clicks. And I only was, my full time there till I was 3.5, 4 years old.
Oh, God, yeah.
You know, but it's weird how when I go back, that's it for me. And so,
isn't that amazing? Like, it feels like it's your city. You're only there for out of diapers barely.
And I've got family back there, and obviously gone back and visited growing up and stuff, but never spent anything more than a week or two, you know, kind of deals. Very short stints, but had a trip planned to New York a month after 9/11. It was already on the books, you know, kind of deal. And I remember people saying, "Are you going to go?" I was like, "Yes, we're going." And for nothing more than that kind of F you, you're not going to take my city away from me kind of deal.
Yeah.
And I remember getting there and starting to walk towards Ground Zero. So we're less than a month removed from it. And as you get closer to Ground Zero, just the amount of debris and stuff that was still all over the streets, and just feeling this sense of, oh my God, what if I had been here for this, and that impact of it. And again, just it driving home that, oh man, this was something so significant. What else could have happened kind of deal.
Right.
And then getting all the way down to Ground Zero, and then you see the posters of, have you seen my loved one? I mean, it just, so for me, not only is it something that I remember watching on TV, but I remember being close to it shortly afterwards that just really ingrained it as my Pearl Harbor, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it's something that as time goes on, like I said, kids today are now just hearing about it. They've got no reference point to it.
Right. There's that famous photo of the White House being reconstructed right after it burnt down the British. And my kids and I always play this like game of history, like little things that happen in history where if one thing goes left or right, things change. And if those knuckleheads don't know or couldn't find the White House that day, they got lost geography-wise in the sky, like what would that have happened if they had found the Capitol or the White House? And then if the passengers don't overtake them in Pennsylvania, like think of, the scarring of DC when we see the towers and they're no longer there and you got the Freedom Tower. But what if they were rebuilding for 8 years later, either the Capitol or the White House? What kind of scarring would that have been on DC? Like, because we only have pictures. There are drawings too, or paintings. There's not even a photograph of that event of the White House being rebuilt. we would have lived through that. Like, holy crap, what a change in our history if you thought 2 buildings affecting us that way. The White House and the Capitol? Oh, my God. I mean, whew, man.
And the thing for me that I always look back on is, so I mentioned my dad worked for American Airlines. I grew up in and around airports, walking around LAX with him as a kid. You probably remember these days where when you would go to the airport, you could just literally walk to the gate, hang out with your family till they were going to get on their flight, and then
high five a pilot.
Yeah. Or as a young kid, hey, could my son come up and sit in the cockpit?
Absolutely.
Kind of deal. And I remember my dad passing away in 2001, early 2001. So we took him back to New York to bury him. And we came off the plane in JFK, and this is February, so 8-10 months before 9/11. Coming off the plane and going, where's my aunt and uncle? You know, couldn't. And JFK had already implemented the secure area where if you weren't a passenger, you couldn't get there. And it was weird for me. I was like, why can't it? And I remember you walk, just like now when you're walking to go get your baggage and you cross that line and said, if you cross here, you can't go back. That was the same thing. But JFK already had that in place.
God, I've been there a million times. I didn't think about that pre.
And so now you look at the impacts. I think the other thing that 9/11 did for us is it brought home how much freedom we have and what other countries have already had in place and the level of security that they have in place that we weren't used to dealing with.
Right.
And so now when you travel, you know, obviously I think most of us have gotten used to it, but you see that what it takes to be safe is it takes a lot of precautions. And you even used the example of technology. What if it had been a period where there wasn't the phones in the airplanes so that the one Flight 93 wouldn't have had the ability to have conversations with their families?
Right.
You know, so there are so many things that, as tragic as it was, because of certain things, because the passengers standing up, because of these pilots not being able to find certain locations, definitely made it an event that could have been much more catastrophic.
Right. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. I mean, they still have the monuments to the ships that went down. What would have DC been like? Like, I mean, if literally, and I don't mean to undermine it, I mean, you sit there over a Pearl Harbor and you're literally looking at wrecked ships and oil bubbles come up. What would they have done to the mall? Would they have rebuilt it? What would they done with the Capitol? I mean, what would they have done? Would they have replicated it? Would they have done a new one? I mean, these are always things my kids and I talk about, like how would they have modernized it? Because when you look at the White House, it's very extremely old with all the updates. The Capitol's extremely old. Would it have been something more like where the Freedom Tower now doesn't look anything like the Twin Towers? It's more modernized, the glass, the structure. Like, would the White House be this really cool modern thing that looks like an Apple, store? Like, what would they have done? If the Secret Service gets involved and goes, oh, now we get to help build this thing. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. Yeah. All that great stuff from the 1800s out the window, getting rid of the brick.
Well, and I'm sure from a security standpoint, had they actually been able to get to the actual White House, not necessarily just from a cosmetic standpoint, but like you said, the security practices that would have been put in place along with how it was rebuilt, you'd see I honestly believe you'd see a completely different White House.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do your little stint in your as an explorer. Is that what the
police cadet?
Police cadet. What's the difference between explorer, police cadet, and then become full officer? What's those 3 stages?
In most police departments, explorers are your under 18 kids.
Okay.
And they're just volunteering their time, usually sometimes after school or on the weekends. And it's just getting them exposure to the department.
Okay.
It gives them the opportunity to go out on ride-alongs. More than likely, it's going to be a uniform position. So it's starting to, I hate to use the word, but kind of indoctrinates them into what.
But it's got a value.
Yes.
Because I see them all the time, especially in Fullerton.
Yeah, the Explorer programs are great. I wasn't that much for whatever reason, I wasn't that much into police work that I wanted to go be an explorer.
But you were later, right? You're after high school.
So then the police cadet program in most agencies, it's a paid position where you're doing you actually have job responsibility. So I had a 40-hour-a-week job as a cadet.
Oh, wow.
Working in the department, and you gain experience, taking reports at the front counter, going and picking up evidence, that type stuff. And then we got the opportunity, me and another cadet got the opportunity to transition and become dispatchers and jailers. So I joke with people and said, I did every paying job in the police department prior to being a police officer before I became a cop. And so I was a cadet, then a dispatcher and jailer, and then I went on into started my law enforcement career.
What training goes into being a jailer?
You have to go to a jail school. They teach you, ironically enough, they teach you how to, handle prisoners.
Right.
And the thing is it's granted you're in a somewhat secure environment in a jail, but you're still dealing with the same people. So a lot of the basic principles of controlling people, talking to people that I used as a police officer were taught when I was a jailer, and in most instances, at least here in Southern California, the deputy sheriffs or the county sheriff controls the jails. So when you get hired as a deputy sheriff, your first job out of the academy is to go work the jail. I get the fact that it's a catch-22. You don't want to keep somebody in there for 6-8 years because then they kind of forget the basics of street cop training. So you go in the academy, they're teaching you to prepare you to work the street, then you finish that and you go work the jail. But the flip side is you get so much great experience in learning how to deal with the criminal element in a controlled setting.
And people, right? Managing people.
Yep.
Jesus, I could not imagine doing that. Like, good Lord, that's crazy. I've done, photo work in jails. I can't imagine actually working those guards day in and day out. Anybody who's probably worked in a correctional environment can attest to this. It's the first time offenders who are usually the bigger problems. The lifers, the people who have been in and out of jail most of their life, they don't usually cause any problems. They're usually they kind of know the routine. Right. And so not that they're settled in kind of.
Not that they're settled in, it's just they understand how the game's played.
Okay.
And so for me, it was kind of a cool sociological experience in that to watch people and how they acted in a custody environment. So for instance, you bring somebody who's been in jail multiple times, the way they're constantly scanning and looking and watching other people, and they're not bringing attention to themselves, whereas that first time person who's been arrested, they're very boastful and they walk into the room and I honestly believe it's more fear-based. Sure. And they kind of want to set the standard. I'm not saying that's the way it is for everything, but it was kind of cool to see just the overall dynamics. Somebody who's been in there, played the game before, they know, hey, I'm going to keep my P's and Q's to myself, deal with what I got to deal with. They rarely gave us jailers significant problems because they knew the routine. And it's like, hey, I'm just going to go along with the flow because
they're moving you from A to B. That's it. Yep. Was there any moment like what were you, probably 19, like 18, where you're like, holy crap, I got this 35, 40-year-old guy. Like, I'm dealing with grown-ass men who have problems in their lives. I mean, you don't get to jail at that point just, by doing something silly. I mean, did that ever put anything in your head like, wow, this is real?
I can't say that I specifically remember one singular event. I do remember that overall, it did teach me my mouth is going to get me in as many problems as it'll get me out of. And I was fortunate that I went to work for what would be considered a smaller agency in Southern California, about 60 to 70 officers. And so there was a culture in there of treat people with respect. Because I remember the old salts telling me, hey, you badmouth this person, you treat them like garbage today. When they get out of jail, where are they going to come back to? They're going to come back home. And now you've got to deal with them again. Or worse, another one of us have to deal with them. And they're going to remember, they're not going to delineate it to a name or a specific officer. It's just like, this police department treated me like garbage.
Right. That guy in that uniform.
Yes. And so I remember very early on learning that, hey, take care of business, treat people with respect. You got nothing to prove. Just do your job, right. And very much ingrained from the get-go. It is just a uniform. It's not you. You know, if you take the uniform off, you're still just Paul.
Right.
And I learned that's the one thing that I learned very early on. And I think being a jailer definitely helped with that. Going
into the police academy, was there any second guessing at any point during that time where you're like, oh, Paul, we really probably should have rethought this. Dodger Academy would have been so much better than this academy. Was there ever that? No. There's never been a point in my career where I look back and went, I made the wrong decision. It's been one that I've completely enjoyed from the get-go. The academy for me was fun. It was structured. You know, it was very much, hey, here's the parameters. Just operate within the parameters and you're good to go. It was the people who tried to push the boundaries that got the attention of the DIs. Right. Was there anything, right? Because when you're in the military, you can be a tank commander, you can be a mechanic, you can do this, that. Was there anything when you joined the police force, were you thinking, I want to be a detective, I want to be in SWAT, I want to fly a helicopter? Was there any of that thought, or was it, I'm a patrolman right now? So that comes back to working for a small agency. We didn't have helicopters. We didn't have a lot of opportunities for assignments. So early in my career, you know. But was that a thought though? Like, if I stay with this small agency, or do I take the academy like to LAPD where I got 10,000 or New York got 10,000? There's opportunities for Paul. I was not looking at that picture when I went into the academy. Okay. I found an agency that I really liked. I wanted to work there. I liked the city that I worked for. I ended up living in the same city for... See, that's even better too, right? Yeah. There's a comfort. And so I was always drawn to the family feel of it, the sense of community, both at work and when I wasn't at work. In hindsight, yes, there were points in my career that you sit there and you go, oh man, it would be great if we had this, if we had this, if we had this. It wasn't an option. So in the academy, I knew I just wanted to get out, work the street, you know, be a good patrol cop. Right. And be like a lot of the older guys that I had seen over the last 3 or 4 years working there, like, okay, I want to be like him, you know, making arrests, doing that stuff. So yeah, in hindsight, there was never a point that I went, oh, maybe I should have gone to a bigger agency because they have all these other options. Now, obviously, into my career, there were points where like, well, what if we had this or what if we had that? Shiny objects. Yep. Was there 2-3 years in, are you comfortable? Was there any like, oh my God, this is way better than I thought, or more of a nightmare than I thought? 2-3 years in, you're still in that point where you're getting tired of working weekend night shift. You know? Yeah. I'd like to be home for a holiday. Yes. I can tell you many a time that I missed Thanksgivings, Christmases, you know. So you start getting into that world, to my own detriment and my own fault, working for a small organization. In my mind at that time, the only cool assignment to work was narcotics. Okay. And so you start getting into 4 or 5 years in, and you put in for it, but you're putting in with 7 other officers. Right. You know? And you're not getting it. And so I found myself going down that path of, it's not me, it's the department's fault. I was blaming them. And I was starting to kind of get that sensation of, I'm really great, you got to pick me. Yes. Yeah. And I wasn't. And not that I wasn't, but I was doing the minimum. Mm-hmm. Where the other guys that were getting those spots were the guys that were putting themselves through training, you know, as opposed to additional training. Yeah, yes. Right. Yeah. Hey, department, I want to go to this. Oh, it's full. You can't go, whatever. Well, okay, then fine. The department won't send me, and taking that kind of mentality. And so it was about the 7 or 8 year mark where fortunately, one of my former training officers was now a sergeant running the FTO program, and really gave me that opportunity and said, hey, I think you'd be a good training officer, but also had that sit down with me of, hey, this is the reputation that you're developing. And so you need to work on changing the perception of Paul in the organization. Did you see that reputation, or even get a sense of your reputation as being like, if I don't get this, I don't do this? In hindsight, now, yes. At the time, I think I was definitely going, because anybody who's worked in law enforcement, there tends to be gaps, or
camps, I'll call it. And you get the camps that become the angry, disgruntled, it's the department's against me.
Right.
And then you get the camps that everything seems to happen great for them. And when you're going down the path of the camp that the department's against me, the hardest thing to do is look in the mirror and say, what am I doing that's bringing this negativity? That comes from maturity. I didn't have the maturity.
Right.
And so I was fortunate enough, I was given the opportunity to be a field training officer, and that really kind of was, it was at least the first catalyst to divert me off of the disgruntled path and go, okay, here's my opportunity to now start going down the opportunity path. But it did also require me to then start evaluating myself and what I was doing. And so then from there I became a detective, and I don't want to say I gave up. I got the opportunity to work. At that time, we had, going back to being a small organization, our detectives were not permanent positions. They were rotational.
Oh.
And so, because you think about it, if you get somebody in there as a detective and then they've locked up that spot, it doesn't allow anybody else to ever be a detective.
That's true, right.
So you have to have rotation. And so you're constantly putting in for the dope spot. And finally you come to a point, you're like, all right, what other opportunities are there? And we had a rotational detective, which kind of back cleanup. You do whatever they needed you to do. And it was a 1-year rotation. And in that rotation, I ended up getting a case where I had my first opportunity to work a fraud investigation. And it was like the skies parted, the sun shone through. It's like, wow, this is fun. And I know for most cops, go back to the academy in that push-up position, the last thing you were thinking about working is a fraud case with a stack of papers that are, 3 feet tall.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it. And right at the...
What did that click in your head? What was the...
It was the mental challenge. It was the game of cat and mouse, but on paper, because you're talking about people doing credit card fraud, check fraud, that type stuff.
Yeah.
And starting to see what really brought it to my attention was the importance of networking, because, hey, this person's using their credit card, so I gotta establish a relationship with this bank investigator so that I get them on my side and they start seeing the big picture. So it's the importance of networking and working as a team. And so the year came up, and just at that same time, we had one of our, it was classified as property crimes. There were 2 detectives assigned to property crimes. One of them specialized in fraud. The other one specialized in burglaries.
Okay.
The fraud guy was rotating. He was promoting up. And because the way our agency worked was most times the guys would go back for their 3-year rotation, and then it was promoting out back to patrol.
Okay.
And so he was promoting up, going back to patrol. His spot opened up, so I went in there. On paper, it should have been a 3-year rotation. And once I got in there, it was, I didn't have a desire to leave the organization. I wasn't interested in really promoting, but I wanted to work these investigations. If you had just came to me and given me the opportunity to be a detective for the rest of my career, I'd have been happy.
Really?
Yeah, it was that much fun. And
wow.
I just went headlong into anything fraud related. So,
but I mean, TJ Hooker wasn't a detective. He was
he
cool.
Well, I could never throw a baton like him. I tried a million times, and I'd ended up hitting myself with it.
I always thought, like, wow, did you really just throw your baton? Was that what the writer, he's like, how are we going to get through this scene here? He can't really pull his gun out and shoot anybody. Wrong show. Baton throwing, yes.
Well, they were competing with Chips. If you remember Chips, I don't think they ever drew their gun.
Never. But, I mean, I'm sure you know lots of CHP officers. That was probably the most excitement for any CHP. It's not that exciting. Maybe a high-speed pursuit here and there. Chips seemed like they were on boats. They were in cars. They were chasing hell. I mean, there was things going on all the time in the valley.
You can't tell me that there aren't a bunch of people who are CHP officers today because of watching Chips.
There are. There's some 50-year-old guys that are like, God damn it, I got hooked. Damn it.
Poncha John, you killed me.
Poncha John and that damn Ford he had with a cool roll bar had got me.
No, it was a GMC.
That's right, GMC. Jesus. It's funny, those little influences is that we see that. And did you have that? Was there ever a moment early in your career where you're like driving in the patrol car going, damn, I'm a cop. Like I'm in a cop car. I got lights. My gun hurts. It's like I got all kinds of, like, was there a moment where it was finally like real for you?
The most real it gets, and I'm sure anybody who's listening to this who's a cop, is that first time you're out on patrol by yourself. and you don't have a training officer sitting across from you in the other seat, feeling like, oh, they're judging every single thing I did.
Right.
You know,
what music I play.
at that time we didn't even have radios in our car.
Yeah.
Well, they wouldn't have. Our agency would pay whatever, if we had a Ford or a Chevy, to take the radios out. So we had just a cubby hole where the radio used to be. But that feeling of freedom, that feeling of I can go turn right down this street and nobody's going to say, why'd you go down this street? You know, because this is where I want to go. And starting to go, okay, what kind of cop do I want to be? How am I going to start furthering myself? And you really just start picking your niche. You know, some guys get really interested in traffic. They want to write 1 million tickets in a shift and eventually ride a motorcycle. And, you know, I mean, talk to anybody about writing a traffic accident report. I remember the first time I got a DUI traffic collision and just all of the forms that were required, to where you come on shift the next shift and that report's still hanging over your head. And you're literally just finding a dark place because I got to start, because at that time, literally still handwriting reports and drawing. And then I used to joke with people, I'm like, you're not going to make me write a 13-page traffic accident report and not get to do the diagram. Because a lot of the people would go, I'll do your diagram for you. It's like, no, that's the fun part where I get to, you know. But just in general, the biggest really kind of pivotal moment of, oh, wow, I'm a cop, was driving out that back gate and being by myself and just being able to choose what I was going to do, what car I was going to stop. And more, it's not that you couldn't do that with your training officer, but there was that feeling of, am I doing what they want me to do?
Well, yeah, it's like when you get your permit as a kid, you're 15 and a half and your parents sitting next to you and they're judging everything you do. And you're like, I can't believe they're letting me drive. Oh my God. Where are we going? We're just going to the grocery store. And it's the biggest drive of your life. Yeah, I'm sure, you know, there's no one there to judge you in that moment. You're just Officer Paul just driving where he goes.
And then the next key point for me was when I became a training officer, because now you're in that, oh man, I'm an old guy. I know some stuff.
Hey there, young buck.
And they're relying on me to train this person to be safe and do the job correctly. And wanting to take everything that was positive in my training and replicate it, and then everything that I felt was negative and not duplicate it, you know? And I, even to this day, as I've promoted up, one of the things I tell new supervisors is, be that supervisor that you would want to work for.
Right.
You know?
Want. If you could pick 3, you want that one.
And be that person. And so the same way was when I had a trainee. Hey, if you want to stop that car, you know, stop that car. I'm not going to judge you. That's your call. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to encourage your decision-making process. Now, if you do something that's unsafe, or I'm going to step in. But it was, you need to learn how to be a cop. You don't need to learn to be somebody who's going to look at me to tell them what to do all the time.
Right.
And so that was a huge turning point for me. It was switching from being the doer to being the teacher.
Right. Now, I don't mean this is a silly question, because it's a question like I'm sure people just want to ask, or it's life. But when you were a police officer and you start meeting people who don't know you're a police officer, and once they did realize, oh, you're a cop, they're not an officer, they just say it's the 3 letters. Was there a difference, even like if you're dating, or like you meet a friend who you meet their friend, like was that awkward in the 90s, early 90s?
It's awkward today in that.
But you're young then.
Yes.
Right. So now you're mature, Paul, and you understand. But young Paul, and you're like, well, what do you, don't look at me weird.
So the one thing I will say is, I don't think any cop who thinks that they don't look like or act like a cop is fooling themselves. My wife tells me this all the time. She goes, you can think that you're just Paul when you're not working. Everybody knows what you do.
Yeah.
It's weird. It grows on you. It just how it is.
The way you scan stuff in the grocery store.
You know, look at some guy who's been in the Marine Corps for 8 years.
Oh.
There's no way around it. You're going to know what he does.
He's a gunny.
Yes. And so as a young officer, when I was encountering people off duty, yeah, I mean, it was awkward, and you would meet people, and you kind of had this thing of, the kind of the stopwatch going off, like, oh, okay, when's the questions going to start? You know, my friend, and so one of the things
I got pulled over by a yeah.
And even if they got pulled over, that was even a little bit better. It seems like the majority of the stories are my friend, you know, and it was always a third removed. And so I kind of got into this mindset of, I'm going to stop you right there. You weren't there. I wasn't there. We don't really know anything that's going on. Let's talk about something else. Yeah. How about them Dodgers, you know? And so I think that early on, I really tried to develop this. That's just my job. You know, if I was a plumber, trust me, you're not going to ask me about the backed up toilet that I worked on today.
Right. Well, that's not nearly as exciting.
No. And so to this day, my wife will still say the same thing. We'll meet, you know, somebody new, go have dinner with a couple or go to a party, and somebody will start asking what I do. And I really tend to downplay it and just kind of move on. And she goes, you got to understand, there's people who are really interested in just what cops do.
Right.
You know? But at the same token, I don't want to turn it into a 2-hour old war stories evening, you know?
Right. Yeah. Oh, the time I got to, yeah. Oh boy, I was putting them down left and right. No, it's a career path that, you know, I think you have to be chosen for. Something clicks, like you said, early for you. And there's always people that I'm sure you know plenty of people. They took 4 or 5 years and they're like, this isn't for me. I tried it. I really thought it just didn't work. Because some people do that in the Marines or the Army or Navy, whatever. They'll do 2 or 3 years. Marines get 6 and they're like, I'm not re-enlisting. It was great, but out. Did you get to that point? Was there a point even before you became a supervisor where you're like, this is close. This might not be for me?
Never for me.
Okay.
And so, like I said before, when I came into the job in '92, we were right at the height of the Rodney King riots. You know, so that's what I started my law enforcement career with, was that negativity.
Yeah.
Now, working for a small agency, still in LA County, there was some residual impact, but it never got to the point that officers today are dealing with post George Floyd. There was no social media in '92. Right. So there was animosity, I think, towards law enforcement, but it wasn't on a grand scale and it wasn't in your face as much, but you experienced it. But on the flip side, I also worked for a city that was very conservative. They were very pro law enforcement for the most part. So it was a weird kind of dichotomy. And so I was always there's never been a point in my career where I've been in a negative position that I don't believe was self-inflicted. Like I told you about, I kind of started going down this path of being maybe a disgruntled. That was driven by me. That was driven by nobody else. But there's never been a point that I went, yeah, this job just isn't for me. And you've said it now twice. And I do remember driving on the 210 freeway with my partner when I was in a detective bureau and we were going to interview somebody. And he goes, there's just some people that this is the job for them.
Right.
And there are some people who do come to this job for the wrong reasons. And, you know, do they need to look at themselves in the mirror and say, are they doing it for the right reasons? That's between them and the mirror. Again, I don't know how it happened. I don't know if it's partly driven by just my natural personality. I never got into this for the badge and the gun. I never got into it because, hey, I get to wear a uniform. It was, I really did just want to give back. I don't have this altruistic, you know, Captain America, I'm going to save the world.
I'm going to solve it.
But there's good guys and there's bad guys. And the one thing I will tell you is the best cops are the ones who grew up kind of walking that line, you know, but for one experience or one event, they could have been on the criminal side of the line as opposed to the police side of the line. And as weird as it is, I think those make us better cops because we're more able to relate to criminals or you know, we didn't.
Or just slipping on a banana peel and being silly. I understand, you know, you see a 14-year-old being dumb. I get it.
Exactly.
But I've been there dumb. But boy, I'm going to get you home. Don't be stupid.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't throw rocks at cars. Right.
You know, and
14-year-old boys are very dumb.
44-year-old boys are very dumb. And I've had that opportunity where you could see that you've interacted with somebody, I'll say a young boy, it's also been girls, but they just made a single bad decision. And if you have obviously, if their bad decision is pulling out a gun and shooting somebody, you can't just kind of go, hey, don't do that again.
Yeah.
But you catch that kid throwing rocks. You know, it's like, did they do anything really that big a deal? Knock it off.
Right. Trespassing in an orange field.
Yeah.
I remember we got in trouble one time in high school for that.
I remember as a kid, going to baseball practice, and practice got over early. The coach had something to do. So this is back in the day where your parents weren't hanging out watching practice.
Yeah.
And it was the one day that I didn't actually ride my bike to practice. So me and like 4 or 5 other kids are waiting on our parents. And so one of them has firecrackers. So what are we doing? We're running around the school, lighting off firecrackers. I think we may have blown like a light bulb out or something. And sure enough, here comes the cops. They could have made it a much bigger deal, but basically it was just, stop being a knucklehead.
Yeah.
Go home.
Yeah.
Don't
you have homework?
Yeah. And so if you keep that ability to still be a human who just happens to wear a badge and a gun and a uniform, that's going to make you a better police officer.
You said something interesting. I was in Montana last year, and I met one of their police officers, and I was talking to him, and he says, the funny thing is I know town's 800 people. He's like, I know everybody. I know Jim, who owns the hardware store, and I know little this guy and little that. And she goes, I see these kids in church. I see them at the Elks Lodge. I'll see them fly fishing in the Madison. He goes, it's very helpful to know everybody. Because I know the little kid, that one that's going to throw the rocks. He's a little squirrely, but that's all right. But I know who comes into this town, and I know who's going to be leaving this town. And that was a big difference for him, he being in such a small town. And then everybody also kind of being pseudo policemen where they know, like, oh, that car's not around here. Because I know when we came in, I was doing a documentary and I had my wife. Everybody knew this black Suburban shows up, and everybody was like, who's that? It was clean, didn't have mud on it. Like, we looked like we were out of town. And it was very interesting to have that town be aware of you and then the officer be aware of you. And I was actually going to meet the chief of police. So once I met him, it was like, oh, okay. Yep. Hey, you're the guy who emailed me. Yeah. But small town. Like, do you ever think of small town or out of town?
I came close. I actually, when I first got hired, there's this unwritten myth. If you don't get out in the first 5 years, you're not going to get out. And so within the first 5 years, I actually went and looked at Prescott, Arizona.
Oh, okay.
But then you start looking at...
that was probably really small then.
Yes. But then you start looking at the pay cut and everything else. And it's just like, oh.
Cost of living, though?
Yeah. For whatever reason, it didn't pencil out, and I didn't make the jump.
There's weird things, too. Like the guy in Montana was telling me, he goes, sometimes I might not be another cop for another 40, 50 miles. That's those other things you take consider. You're out there sometimes.
I give credit. My former partner at the DA's office where I work now, he worked the far east end of this county as a deputy. And
whoa,
you're talking like, hey, there's 2 or 3 of us for about 40 square miles. I'm
right.
But needless to say, your backup's a while away. That's got to be. That's the one aspect of law enforcement that I've never experienced. I mean, I remember working patrol in my city, and I mean, we're a decent sized city. We're 18 square miles, but 2 o'clock in the morning when there's not a lot of noise and you've asked for a partner to come, you hear that car coming,
right? Because
after every stop sign or after every red light, it's foot to the floor, and even the people the suspects you were dealing with, they knew who was coming. They could hear it too.
Right. Just revving all the way coming in a quiet neighborhood. Yeah.
And so the men and women who have to work those remote areas, I give them the utmost respect because, you think, your backup code 3 is still 25 to 30 minutes away.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe, if you're lucky.
And like he was saying, he goes, we got to deal with weather. I was talking about stuff, and he goes, I might have snow tires on and chains, and I got to deal. And I can't go 90 miles an hour on the road. I'm in a pinch where I'm trying to do 40 and stay on the road. I got snow drifts. I got to watch out for freaking moose and elk and all these things. And I was like, oh, I know guys in Anaheim or Fullerton. They don't have to worry about mooses or elk. Like, there's nothing like that. It's like a totally different world when you're country cops and sheriffs. And I was like, whoa, Jesus.
Even there's something I want to hit on about the small town aspect, but real quick while we're thinking about it. Just being a cop in severe elements.
Yeah.
So you're a cop working middle of Montana, South Dakota, where, it's getting sub-zero. Wisconsin, the amount of gear that you have to wear on top of still trying to have all of your safety equipment available to you, it's got to be.
Yeah.
You're going out like the Michelin Man and then still trying to do police work.
And then that's just in your truck or car.
Yeah.
Then when you get out, what you got to put on? Oh, Jesus.
But then the flip side of it too is you look at the officers who are working Lake Havasu.
Phoenix.
120 degrees, by 10 a.m. I remember those days, even in Southern California, it's like you're an hour into your shift, your shirt's completely soaked. You sit down and your vest pops out a little bit and you get this waft of hot air that, So just being a cop out in the elements, because that's one of the things that I don't think a lot of people think about is, okay, they see us driving around in a black and white doing police stuff, but they don't really think about, wait a minute, they still have to do police work when it's pouring down rain or it's sub 30 degrees, and all of the added issues that come with being a cop in the elements.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you were going to say something about some small town?
The one thing I will say, yes, small town, everybody knows you, but I will guarantee you, even somebody who works NYPD, LAPD, the biggest agencies you can think of, they're assigned to a section.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that officer, if they're doing their job correctly and are into it, they know who belongs there, who doesn't belong there. Mm-hmm. Whether you like it or not, and this is not about racial profiling or anything, the thing about being a cop is knowing your environment.
Right.
And who belongs there, who doesn't. So in that sense, yes, when you work for a small town, you know everybody. But even if you work for a big agency, you're assigned to, most often, officers work the same area, the same beat, whatever you want to call it, for extended times of their career. And they come to know everybody. They come to know the people who know what's going on in the area. So that's your first point of like, hey, if you need to find out some information, I need to go talk to this lady on this street corner or this, this liquor store and over, because they know what's going on.
They see, yeah.
But the same way, you think that it's actually amazing how much you recognize as normal when you pay attention a little bit. Cars in the area, And so all I was going to say is, yes, when you work for a small agency, but I guarantee you it's the same thing if you just boil it down.
Quadrants.
Yep.
I got this corner quadrants. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It's unbelievable. I always marvel. You see, like, if they'll represent like in old films, like the old beat cops, Boston, Chicago, New York. They used to walk the beat. And they would just have a stick back then, but they would know, Miss So-and-so on the corner. She's a bit nosy and she's always got her eyes out on the stoop and she knows who's who. And that's who you'd go talk to. She'd be your eyes on that area.
Yep.
What do you see, Mrs. So-and-so's not supposed to be over here. His car's parked the wrong way. Oh, parked the wrong way. I'll go take a look.
For those who've been in law enforcement a long time, the old George Thompson and verbal judo training, if anybody's been to it. But I still remember him telling a story of a cop in Denver. And the thing that he used to do was he would wear a hat back when it wasn't required, a law enforcement style hat, like the bus driver style hat. And I still remember the story today. And I went to that training 35 years ago. But he was saying, he goes, the cop told me, he goes, I wear this hat for one reason. He goes, because when I walk up to, especially at that time, older people, taking my hat off was a sign of respect. And it was just simply as a prop that he would use, put it under his arm, because already you're establishing that I'm coming to you out of respect. I'm coming to you because you have something that's going to benefit me, and I want to show you that proper deference to that.
Interesting. Yeah, so, I mean that's smart.
And I know this gets overused a lot, but that's what being a good cop is.
Right.
It's learning your environment and learning how to operate within it properly. I know today there are some agencies that they're trying to regulate cussing by their officers. Unfortunately, there's a segment of society that's their normal vernacular. And I'm not saying you're trying to be their friend, but there's a sense of, I'll even go back to the military. You talk to anybody who's been in there, the DI for the most part, when they're not yelling, all right, things are good. But when they start yelling, oh, I got to pay attention.
Right.
There's just those things, you know. We were all in school. When the teacher finally had enough and she'd whack her pointer on her desk, you knew time. It was like, oh, okay, knock it off. And so it's just about finding balance. You can't go to, you know, little old lady who had the lemon stolen off her tree and like, what the F you want us? You know, you've got to learn to temper it and talk to people accordingly.
Know your audience.
Know your audience.
When did you see tech start to come into your career? When things were, I don't know, what was your day-to-day when you first started? Was it just a simple gun belt, handcuffs? I mean, and now the poor guys are just like weighted down with everything. They all look like they're like 5 months pregnant with their chests and everything. When did you start to see it coming in?
You're really making me feel old. So I did 16 years at my first agency, and then I've done the last 15 at the DA's office. And just real briefly as a side note, every DA's office is a law enforcement agency. Right. The only difference is they don't have a front-facing enforcement action. So what I mean by that is they don't have black and whites driving around with DA investigators. So it's a giant detective agency. So my first 16 years at my first agency, we were just getting into tech. So when the first car-mounted cameras came was after I was already a detective. So I didn't have that going out on patrol. When I first started on patrol, it was a walkie-talkie, your gun, a couple extra magazines, and a couple handcuffs. Your baton if you carried it, but if anybody who's been in law enforcement long enough remembers the PR-24, it was basically useless. It either sat in the door pocket or it sat under the headrest, you know? And that's all we carried.
Isn't that crazy?
Tasers came in after I was a detective. So the detectives aren't the ones getting assigned the priority. The guys working the street need it. Right. So I've always kind of been one step behind it. Body-worn cameras. You know, the DA's office now has body-worn cameras for our investigators who are working in field assignments.
Did you have a vest when you started?
Yes, I did. Okay. But it was taped on and it was rocks. No. We had vests, but
a lot of cardboard.
Yes, more.
But I remember guys, though, when I was working out in the 90s, they didn't have vests yet. Even LAPD, like, oh, I'm at a SC game. I don't have a vest. But he still was fully armed. It was interesting, like, know your audience.
When I started, it was still, obviously, it goes in conjunction with department policy. Policies have changed. But at that time, I remember the old timers in the summer, they would take out their back panel just because, you know, try to reduce the amount of heat. Right. So they would just wear the front panel. You know, it's what you get used to. I got used to wearing a vest from the get-go, and it was weird to put on a uniform shirt and not have a vest on.
Did that evolve, the vest itself, for you through your 15 years? Did it get different?
Oh, definitely. You look at what a vest today and a vest back then, the amount of stopping power without overly increasing the thickness or rigidity is amazing. And then even now where more agencies are going to plate carriers, you actually can go to ceramic plates that can stop up to rifle rounds. So yeah, the technology is amazing of what they've been able to do. And that's driven by the military. Right.
And technology and things get passed down. It's very weird how the military it's tech. It bleeds down into law enforcement for the better in a good way. Like, you know, it's trained, it's field operated. It goes through battle tested.
I've used this example from the opposite side, and I know that there are people who feel that law enforcement has become too militarized. If you're going up against an opponent, do you want to come in with the equal amount of tools or a lesser amount of tools? That's at the end of the day. Right. But let's take it to the flip side. I remember when I first started in law enforcement, we're just starting to see. We're going into the Gulf War, and a lot of the military doctors had not experienced battle wounds. So what did they do? They contracted with County USC Medical Hospital, who was seeing AK-47 type injuries.
Yeah, complete body shredding.
With the gang members on the street to give the military doctors training.
Right.
I'm talk about my podcast, but I've had a guest on who was one of the LAPD officers that rolled in on the North Hollywood bank shooting.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Longtime SWAT guy. And he talks about how it changed because early on, when our military got into this urban style of fighting, the initial influx into the Middle East and the Gulf Wars, they were sending SEALs to train with LAPD on house-to-house clearing type techniques because that's not what the military had done before. So it's a yin and a yang that will always ebb back and forth. And at the end of the day, technology of what becomes available, you're like, well, that's available to us. Let's have the same thing. You could even just boil it down to look at some Army private today and the tech that they have available to them.
To your dad.
Just to my dad, or even just somebody who went into the military Desert Storm.
Right.
You would think a private today in the military is probably like, oh man, the guy must be special forces. No, this equipment works to keep our people safe.
Right. Where were you when the Hollywood shootout went down?
I was working. I can't say I specifically remember.
Do you remember seeing that footage?
Yes.
And going, holy crap.
Yes.
This is not Somalia. This is happening in LA. That was bonkers.
That was a huge pivotal moment for law enforcement and having access to high-powered rifles, readily accessible. I'm still of the era where you went 10-8 with the shotgun,
right.
And you had double-aught buck and a couple slugs, and then all of a sudden we started going to we got to outfit the cars not only with a shotgun, but we now got a double rack, and you've got an M16,
right?
Now
Style.
an AR-15 or an M4. And then to go completely away from that to just an M4 and a less lethal shotgun. I'm of that era, and I'm sure anybody who's been in law enforcement for more than 20 years, there's something about racking a 12 gauge that gets people's attention.
Yep.
And so it's a tool that I'm kind of sad to see has gone away from law enforcement.
I don't know where it's at. I don't know if it's San Bernardino, Riverside, but I did this maybe 15 years ago. Maybe it was 29 Palms, but there was a training facility, and they had like all these weapons manufacturers out here. And they had the media out, and they were running you through like what this gun did. And it was like a swap meet, but all the military was there, and all law enforcement brought people. And I remember someone saying, we're going through this stuff, like, you want to know what pepper spray feels like, all these things. And one of the guys was saying, you want to stop someone coming into your house, just rack a 12 gauge. That's the international symbol in sound of turn around and get the hell out, because everybody knows that sound. He goes, you don't even have to have anything in it, but damn if you do, because that sound's going to make someone piss on your floor as they're running away. That's such a sound that you could just hear. Close your eyes and you could just hear it, and it really puts the fear of God in people. It's
got an intimidation factor to it, and I don't know if, obviously, kind of driven a little bit by the movies and what people see can happen from a shotgun, but it has an impact. And like you said, and from my 2 cents, and I don't want to go down the whole gun thing. Right. My 2 cents, you want a good home protection weapon? 12 gauge shotgun.
Yeah. Or at least have it recorded so you can just hit the button.
Right below your ring camera.
Yeah. Honey, just hit the shotgun sound. Just keep hitting it until they get
and
the
if
hell
that doesn't
out.
work, then the Rottweiler dog barking.
Exactly. That, or like in Ferris Bueller, where she is, I have a raging case of herpes. Just scream that one out. So somebody hopefully at that point will turn around. Where's the moment for you where you say, I'm going to jump into a DA's office?
Coming to the end of my time as a detective and kind of seeing the light at that end of the tunnel, I had actually a little bit begrudgingly taken the test for the next promotional rank to corporal. So that was happening my end of the time. And I was basically saying to myself, wow, 16 years in, and I'm going to be the junior corporal back on weekend night shift.
Did it seem to go fast?
Oh, it's gone by in a blink of an eye. In certain retrospects.
Right.
Obviously, there were those stretches as a young officer where you're constantly working weekend nights where you're like, can I please get to a normal shift? But for the most part, no.
Paul wants to work 9 to 5.
Yes. Well, and the thing that I tell people is, if you are a police officer and you want to keep your normal friends, get into a detective assignment as quickly as you can, because then you're going to be technically, for most part, working Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, when 90% of the rest of the population works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, try being the guy who's trying to, even if you want to date somebody.
Right.
You know, hey, I got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday off. You know, you want to go? No, I got to work.
Yeah.
You know,
of course, I can only date from 1 to 5 p.m.
Exactly.
So if you're available for a late lunch,
I've got to go to court this morning. You know, so I would say that's the one thing for me that really kind of, once I got into the detective bureau, a lot of things changed. You get a normal-ish schedule. If you've got kids, all of a sudden you don't have to worry about, hey, I can't make Saturday's softball game because I've got to go work patrol. You know, so there are so many things that come from being a detective that once you're used to it, it's kind of like, oh, do I really want to give this up? And so I had a friend of mine. I'd not really even considered the DA's office prior to that. And then a friend of mine who had left.
Not on your radar at all.
No. I interacted with a couple of them.
Right, but
as a detective in the courthouses, but never anything that really kind of was like, oh, that's something I want to go do. And then a friend of mine left his agency and went to the DA's office and goes, you really need to think about, you know, doing this. And so I went out and I kind of did a tour, went to lunch with the hiring supervisor, and it's like, this is what I'm going to do. Because again, it was giving me that opportunity to just basically transition from being a detective at this agency to being a detective at the DA's office. Again, at that time, and I've even said this in the promotional process, what I perceive as my greatest failure is not pushing myself sooner to promote. Because probably some of the best fulfillment I've gotten as a police officer is being a supervisor, where you're maybe not have your hands in as much, but you have the ability to benefit and impact those doing it, you know, kind of deal. So you're able to, as I use the term, you're able to provide top cover. You need to get this job function completed. What do you need from me to get that task done? And so you get fulfillment in getting them what they need. And so went to the DA's office, and just in my mind at that time, 2008, I'm just going to be an investigator for the rest of my career.
And it worked.
And it worked. Fortunately,
it felt just like you.
Yes.
Perfect blend.
Yes. And I was able to keep working fraud, got to do computer forensics, all this stuff that isn't perceived as cool in law enforcement, and at the same time be on our tactical team or our SWAT team. So I kind of wore 2 hats.
Right. And you mentioned, I wanted to talk about this, computer forensics, which when you started wasn't even a thing. Now it's a massive thing.
Yes. There isn't, I don't know of a criminal investigation today, 99% of them, that doesn't involve some sort of digital device that is going to need to be examined.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got your phone. I mean, there's so many things that's a computer. It's not the old dial-up like your mom had. No.
And the ability to store data, the ability to transfer data that is going to be pertinent to your criminal investigation. So yeah, no, the change in technology from a investigation component, and what, not necessarily the technology that you get to use, but the technology that you have to remember to preserve and get access to. You know, and now you're dealing just with the growth of the cloud and remote storage.
Oh, the amount of bandwidth you got to keep track of. Good Lord.
Fortunately, let's just say that unless somebody is in that world and doing it as a job, they know just enough to be dangerous in that if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so for the most part, we're able to get access to, are we getting all of it? No, but we're definitely getting enough to prove cases.
Wow.
Now, obviously, somebody who's more adept at it, just like anything, why do we still talk about Jack the Ripper today?
Right.
They knew to do just enough to make it to where, ooh, who is it? Kind of same way with digital evidence. Mm-hmm. For the most part, we're getting 95 to 98% of it. Is some of it getting biased? Of course, but we're getting the majority of it.
I mean, so you start in 2008. That's about when the iPhone comes out and that game changer of how that evolves things.
Started with the DA's office in 2008.
Right. So, in your forensics computer, being a detective and all that stuff, where it's how much is the phone, it affects our lives in general, how much is the phone affected criminal elements and what you have to search forensic-wise?
It's, in one sense, made it easier because the capability of any cell phone today, if you had to measure what a computer was 30 years ago that could do the same thing our cell phone would do, you'd almost need a trailer to pull it behind you.
Right, yeah.
And so early on, the early days of forensics, you were still dealing with fixed computers, laptops. Mm-hmm. I mean, even going from desktop to laptops was a game changer because now the laptop was, in essence, mobile.
Right.
Every iteration has caused hiccups, I'll use, for law enforcement in trying to, because we're always playing catch up. Mm-hmm. And so I remember working even as a patrol officer and running into people who were buying laptops with stolen credit cards, doing their online crime. And then if the laptop was seized, they didn't care because they would just go get another one. But their life per se wasn't wrapped up in that laptop. Now, with the cell phones, you can still do all of that. You can do your online purchases. You can do your, sharing of files, child porn, whatever. But also in conjunction with that, you can track virtually their entire life, where they're at, who they're talking to.
Right.
All of that aspect was never in a laptop.
Yeah, I have a friend. We do script writing, and we're doing a story that's in the 80s. And you start to think about we both grew up in the 80s, what we didn't have, and how criminal elements were back then. Today, the tracking device, because if it's a GPS, I'm pinging off of cell towers on the way over here, listening to Audible and stuff like that. Like, it's got such a map of everything you do, that phone. Like you say, the history, where in the 80s, I had to give you that information. I had to, I am now going here and leaving notes. That thing is such a trail to everything you do. Does that make your job easier or harder when you're doing that investigation?
I'm going to say from my experience, and this is my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, because this is.
It actually makes ours easier. And why I mean that is because today, a cell phone is not a luxury that you can choose not to have. Everything outside of criminal activity is driven by our phones. The humans they take the path of least resistance whenever possible. Yes. We're like water.
Yes.
And so because so much is done on a day-to-day that's not criminal activity that we just become used to doing, that for the most part, criminals just incorporate their criminal activity within it. And so for me, I see it as something easier. I'll use the analogy of try to travel today and not have a credit card. It's virtually impossible. Can you just walk up to a hotel and make a hotel reservation without a credit card? No. They've made it to where, hey, we want your credit card. So in that sense, it's convenience. And, yes, I can call up on a phone and reserve me a room. Here's my credit card. But if you're looking at it from the nefarious side of it, try to operate today and not be tracked. Yeah. So I see it as a positive for law enforcement because the fact that so much of the rest of daily life and the rest of operating within society is still done on a cell phone.
Yeah, that thing is so powerful. It's unbelievable. I saw a study where they said there's a measurement of time in which, let's say we're going to go to San Luis Obispo and you're 40 minutes away from the house. Will you be willing to turn around and come back? And 40 minutes seems to be like the time limit. If you've left your phone, people will decide, I'll go back 40 minutes and then proceed. And now I've lost almost 2 hours for the weekend to be without my phone, even though my wife has hers. I can't be without mine.
It's crazy how much we as a society have, and you could try to deny it, but we've become dependent upon it.
Oh yeah.
I'll practical example. Now, I'll use the excuse that because of my position that
Right.
I'm kind of always on call-ish.
Yeah.
But if you're not if you're just an employee worker at a company, is there a reason why you need your phone on the weekend? So what I'm getting at
Yeah.
is you really don't have a connection to your job on the weekend or when your time is off. So other than connection to your friends and family, and if you're at home with your family, is there really anybody that you need to talk to? But yet we won't be more than an arm's length from our phone at any given time.
Yeah. So a dear friend of mine, I've known him for a very long time, Michael Durr. He reaches out to me. We go out coffee and stuff, and he reaches out to me a couple months ago and says, "Hey, I got a buddy. You got to listen to his podcast. I think he's going to make a great guest, but you got to listen to his podcast." And so I go down the rabbit hole of, we all do, YouTube rabbit holes and podcast. And I probably listened to 4 or 5 of the podcasts that you were doing. And they were really interesting, really good stories about a lot of people with good times, bad times, interesting times, times of their lives when things were going way sideways and they brought it back. Where is it in a cop's time, in an officer's time, do you decide that, hey, I think I've got a couple minutes in my day that I wanted to devote? Because when I saw that you were an officer, not just like you were a general contractor that liked to talk to former first responders, but that you were also thick as thieves in this thing, that like, you know what? There's nothing better than instead of making a deck, I'm going to go out and hear other people's stories in the field in which I work. Like, what was that genesis?
So, in my defense, as you can attest to this,
There's 12 people in this room, just so people...
starting a podcast, the one thing nobody ever tells you, hey, it's going to take up a lot of your time.
I feel like we're in an AA program.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Paul, and I'm a podcaster.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm a podcaster.
And that wasn't, that component of it never really kind of got on the radar. Once you get into it, you're like, oh, I've got to track down guests. I've got to schedule guests. I've got to take time away from my life. Hey,
well, what were you listening to? Who were you listening to? What podcast were you listening to before you started yours?
So for me, I came to the podcast world when I decided to start promoting up for leadership. And so this is 2017.
Okay.
Started reading all the books, Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership.
Yep.
Jocko's got a podcast.
Damn it, Jocko, you hooked him.
Yes.
And Rogan got him, so that's even, yeah.
And I was peripherally at that point in time listening to Rogan, but definitely not regularly.
Okay.
Jocko was definitely my step off point to get aspects of leadership training.
Okay.
From there, there's another podcast, Cleared Hot, by Andy Stump, who's also a former Navy SEAL. And I will give him credit right now. I was part of his little Patreon group, and I bugged the shit out of him with questions on starting a podcast. So I hope that if there's a chance he listens to this, thank you, Andy, because I actually did take the advice you gave me in finding equipment and all that kind of stuff. But also, too, and I will give him credit, I liked his interview style.
Okay.
So those were the podcasts that I was listening to. Fast forward to COVID. Within our organization, and my chief of investigators, during a management meeting, came up with an idea. Hey, we need to have a better network of our retirees that can be a source of information for those coming towards their retirement to kind of reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about leaving law enforcement to go do what you did, and can you help me out? That was the impetus of it.
Okay.
Because I listened to podcasts, and he wanted to do, he's like, his thought was kind of like, we don't need to bring him in person where everything is being done over Zoom and Teams and everything else. Let's just kind of set up a lunchtime chat and they can answer questions. Sounded like a podcast to me, so I jumped on it.
You raised your hand.
I raised my hand. And I did we scheduled a couple of them.
Oh, Paul.
I know.
Then one day you should have been sick.
Don't ever volunteer. I do a couple of the podcast, or see, I'm already calling it a podcast.
Yeah, you're already. He's got a stage, everything.
It was a podcast. We do a couple of these lunchtime chats, and I start getting feedback from some of my coworkers, like, "Hey, you did a good job. You should really think about doing a podcast." And I was like, "Doesn't sound like a bad idea. How much time could a podcast take?
Come on, I'm getting paid to do this one.
It's just a conversation. Push record, push stop. It's a podcast." And the worst thing you can do is Google how to do a podcast, because it'll tell you.
Yeah.
You could do it right off your phone.
Off your phone. It's as easy as hitting record.
Yeah. And anybody who listens to podcasts knows that, you know, the ones that are done off their phone, they're hard to listen to because the audio, it's like you don't realize how important audio quality is until you try to listen to a podcast that isn't recorded well.
Right.
And
they also don't say the ones recorded on their phone only last two episodes. Yeah. The asterisk you don't see at the bottom.
Or the going back to the whole computer thing, how long does it take to download the data off of your, because most people don't record that much data on their phone at one time.
Yeah. See, now you got a 275 meg file you got to airdrop or something. Yeah.
So that was what kicked it off. I was like, all right, this is a good idea. And so I knew immediately what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus on that importance of preparing today for what you're going to do tomorrow. Because the one thing about law enforcement or any first responder career is they end. They're not designed to be, in theory, hey, you're 75 years old, here's your gold watch, go enjoy your walker and your Metamucil. And so for most first responders, it's about 50 to 55 that, hey, you're eligible to retire, but you're still quite young.
Sure.
So there was that importance of think about what you want to do tomorrow. Where it grew, though, is once I realized, okay, I'm gonna go down this rabbit hole and figure out what it's going to do, what it's going to take to do a podcast. I quickly realized, well, first responder community and the military community, the one thing that we share is they do a great job of recruiting us in. Hey, look at all the cool stuff we have. Look at the gold and green helicopter that we have. Look at the fast boats and the machine gun, whatever it is. But when it comes time to exit, it's, hey, it was good knowing you. Don't let the door hit you in the ass.
Yeah.
So quickly it was like, okay, I want to target first responders and I want to target the military community. Then I started looking, it's that rabbit hole thing. You start going, well, wait a minute. One of the other aspects that both of them share is somebody may come in today and go, I'm going to do a career. I'm going to do 20 years. I'm going to do 30 years. Tomorrow, I blow out a knee. I blow out a back. All of a sudden, I got forced into my transition or my retirement way before I was ever even planning to.
Yeah, I'm 36. What am I going to do?
Exactly. And
that's frightening too. I mean, to think about it.
And that's why I kind of use the analogy of we all jump on this roller coaster thinking that we're going to ride it all the way to the end, but sometimes the roller coaster stops working and says, hey, get off. And it's not like, well, no, I want to stay on for the ride. No. And unfortunately, for the greater majority of us, especially when you're dealing with an injury, you just become a line item on their budget sheet. And it becomes more cost effective to say, hey, we'll pay you for your retirement than to try to work with you and help you get back to full duty. Okay, so now my scope is increasing. I've got people who are making it to retirement. What are they going to do afterwards? But wait a minute. I want you to think about what you're going to do tomorrow, even if tomorrow happens to be tomorrow. So start at least just thinking about it. Start developing your network of who you're going to reach out to should you be forced into that situation.
Was any of this easier because you were closer to the end of your career than the beginning of your career? You weren't 23-year-old Paul?
I think it was easier because I was now in a position of leadership. And the one thing that we always think about as a leader is you have to be thinking about succession planning. You have to be thinking about the seat that you're sitting in today because you're just renting it.
Right.
It's not yours permanently. And the worst thing that you can do for your organization, and this isn't just the first responder or military community, this is any company. Mm-hmm. If you're not bringing your people up so that tomorrow, if you're not there, somebody can sit in the seat and keep the ship going, then you're failing as a leader. So that's what made it easier, because it was easier for me to think about, what can I give back to my team, my people, and I'll use my audience in my podcast world. What can I give back to them to help them prepare for their tomorrow? Right. So that, I would say, as a leader, made it a little bit easier for me. Obviously, yes, I'm coming close to the end of my career also, so it's something that is a more frequent thought.
Right, because what would 23-year-old Paul have been thinking? I mean, I'm sure your mindset would have been a little different with your guests.
Yeah, 23-year-old Paul is like, well, I'm going to be doing this for the next 30 years, so
yeah.
I don't even need to think
what do you got to tell me, dude?
Yeah.
I'm the man.
Tomorrow I'm going to be a cop, and 10 years from now I'm going to be a cop.
Yeah.
But again, it's that not having, it's all about experiences. Maybe if I had had a couple experiences of people who blew out a knee or blew out a back and had to find something else to do, right, I might have thought about it more.
Yeah, can you imagine 25-year-old Paul then blows his back out, can't do the job anymore? Oh.
And that's the thing is the unfortunate thing for many in the military and many first responders, you can get a significant enough injury that's simply enough that doesn't allow you to do that job anymore. Mm-hmm. For the most part, it may not even have a noticeable impact on your day-to-day life as a person. Regular person. It just means that you're not that you're not eligible. You're more of a liability if we allow you to keep doing this job. Right.
We need you to do X, and this will not allow you to do it.
Correct. And so that's where it was, the genesis of it all came from, and then quickly realizing, and this comes just from the last, 5 years, 10 years, whatever you want to look at it as. It doesn't matter what position in life you're in. If you just pay attention to the news, the number of suicides for both the first responder and the military community has gone through the roof.
Right.
And I knew that for me, I wanted to also address the importance of, okay, start thinking today about what you're going to do tomorrow, but also equally important, take care of yourself today. Get to that point, whatever your transition is going to be. If it's, hey, I want to go play golf and hang out with my grandkids, great. But be in the best physical condition and the best mental space you can be to go enjoy that. And that comes with 30 plus years of being in this job. Of the whole mental health aspect was not something that was talked about when I started. And for the most part, I'll put myself in that box. I hadn't really experienced anything majorly traumatic in my life growing up. Yes, was I raised by a very strict father? Did I know what it was like to get a good old-fashioned ass whooping? That type stuff. But seeing dead bodies, seeing mangled car crashes, seeing kids who were abused, all of this stuff, I had never experienced any of that.
Right.
The problem is that when you bring in young men and women into these fields, they, for the most part, haven't experienced that also. We don't build in, well, how are you going to deal with that? Because there's a Rubik's Cube between our ears, and that stuff is not what normal people deal with. Mm-hmm. And so where I'm going with this is that I wanted to present people who have faced their own mental health issues and what they did to get out of it. And so I knew that with the podcast, as much as, hey, tell me about what you're doing today, but more importantly, you've experienced trauma and you've experienced post-traumatic stress, whatever. Mm-hmm. How did you handle it? And what worked for you? Because I could sit in every episode and say, hey, if you're not feeling good, go talk to somebody. If you're not feeling good, go talk to somebody. And it's going to become white noise. But I have a guest who is a retired MARSOC Marine. Holy Jesus, you're Captain America. And he talks about, yeah, I almost ate my gun. That's going to resonate.
Sure.
And if we can normalize that it's okay to ask for help, and I'm not saying it's not occurring. It is changing. Mm-hmm. the growth of peer support within organizations, the normalizing of talking to psychologists is definitely changing. I have a friend of mine. She was my first guest on the podcast. She started out as a cop, became a psychologist, now is a psychologist for law enforcement officers. And she said the one thing for her is bigger organizations who have the ability to bring psychologists in-house to where you just become part of every day. It's not like, oh, Dr. So-and-so is coming on Wednesday at 12 to 1. Who wants to talk? I'm not going to go talk to the doctor. But
and I'm certainly not going to raise my hand in front of everybody to go say I'm talking to the doctor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you have an office and somebody can just walk by and go, hey, nobody's looking. Hey, doc, you got a second? Kind of deal. Mm-hmm. And so that normalizing of it is where we got to keep going with this. I'll even take it to the point that I would like to see organizations stress because everybody has the opportunity to be a leader. The young men and women coming out of the academy, going into law enforcement, going into the fire department, going into working as a paramedic on an ambulance, they all have the same thing. They all have a training officer. That person who's been around for a while, who's doing the job. If we could normalize training officers after that first experience, seeing somebody with a severed arm or going to that horrendous child abuse call, get out in the car and go, how'd that make you feel? Are you doing okay with that? If this kind of turned you sideways, there's nothing wrong with that. As opposed to, hey, we got our next call, let's go.
Yeah, off we go.
You know? And so even starting...
You think it'll ever get to that point?
I think it can. I think that more and more organizations are going to this model. I know that of late, people bemoan the millennials. Oh, they're so into their feelings. But it actually has had a positive impact because organizations now, you can bemoan millennials all you want. That's our workforce. And you have to create an environment that makes your employees thrive. Mm-hmm. If your employees are more about their feelings, then you've got to be, as an organization, more in tune to the importance of people's feelings. And there's nothing wrong with that. At the end of the day, we're all just human beings. And our feelings drive us. If you're somebody who's constantly bottling it up, I guarantee you, your organization is going to deal with your feelings down the road because you're going to then turn it into anger or resentment or something else.
Right.
Regardless, it's still a feeling, and your organization's going to reap the negative benefits of it. So why not at the front end start getting into normalizing? Do you feel okay? And if you legitimately do, then great.
Yeah, and hit that next call. If you need a moment.
And it may not be something where, hey, that call really screwed me up. I can't keep working. Hey, we still have a job to do. But when we get done with this shift, here's some resources for you, or let's get through these couple calls, see how you're doing. If you really need to take a step back, then we'll figure it out. So there is, unfortunately, the yin and the yang.
Right.
It's still a job that requires us to be able to move to the next call, but don't bury our head in the sand and just, I bring it back to a training officer. Don't get to the end of the shift and just completely ignore the fact that you dealt with a horrific call and not even talk to your trainee about it.
Yeah. So where is it where you go, okay, I'm going to come up with a name. I'm coming up with time. My first guess, like what was that like? Because that's always our challenge as a podcaster, to come up with name and time. And, honey, I got to buy this weird thing.
Road. Yeah. You make so much stuff that it's like...
shiny buttons.
Yeah, stuff that nobody else knows what you're talking about, but when you see it, you're like, oh.
When my wife saw this, she's like, what are you, a music producer? What the hell is this thing? Yeah, I'm a music producer for like a kindergarten class.
And then the worst thing is that you start looking, you watch other podcasts and you see all the gear and equipment they have. You're like, oh, I want that. Then you start looking at the price of it. This is expensive.
Yes. Yeah,
for something that I'm not getting paid for.
Right. Or Rogan keeps referencing over Jamie this, Jamie that, Jamie. I'm looking around. I don't have a Jamie. Christ. Yeah. I don't have a studio manager.
But so the rabbit hole was to just quickly. So the first thing that I wanted to do was, because of the Rogan effect, is I knew I wanted to do video along with audio from the get-go. I didn't want to be a year into just doing audio and then go, oh, hey, let me add audio in or add video in. But you don't think about the logistical nightmare that adding video to a podcast creates. You talk about file size. Try transferring a video file to your editor remotely. Forget it. You might as well set it off on Tuesday and pick it up next Wednesday. So there were all those little things that I didn't realize. But I'll make it simple. The name immediately came to me. Transition drill comes from anybody who's worked in a special operations or SWAT community. Transition drills are what we do all the time.
Okay.
And where it comes from is your primary platform, generally speaking, your rifle, is what you're working with. It stops working for whatever reason. Goes empty, jams. You don't, if you're engaged in a situation, it's not something to go, oh, let me think. No, it's the rifle goes to your side, you go to your handgun, and you transition and get back in the gunfight as soon as you can. And then when you have a lull, you can go figure out what the rifle's going on. I looked at our careers as the same way. We all have a plan for what we're going to do, and that's our primary platform. When we get to that transition point, whether it's from retirement, from an injury, it's 2023, we're under a microscope, you do something that says, your agency goes, hey, sorry, there's the door. You have to be able to transition to something else, not just sit there with a dumbfounded look on your face like, what am I going to do? So transition drill. As far as getting into it, I got very lucky. I happened to ask a coworker a question about cameras. And when I told him I was going to do a podcast, he's like, oh, can I help? And the other aspect that he brought up was editing. I didn't know how to do any editing.
You hadn't that?
None of it. And so I honestly thought it was push record the episode, push stop, push it out as a podcast.
It magically shows up on you.
And so all of a sudden you start looking at, you get into doing podcasts, and anybody who's done one knows this. Stuff has to get edited out. You make mistakes. I've made mistakes forgetting to hit the record button, forgetting to hit I've had issues with the video. I've done interviews that have gone so long that have exceeded the memory card on my video camera. So you learn all of these little things.
Oh, Jesus.
But it literally is all just learn as I go.
Right.
And I am very fortunate that I got the right people with me, and my editor saves my bacon. Something as simple that I didn't realize, you're setting up a video camera and you think the image looks correct and level, and then he gets it and he goes, you are crooked. Look at the picture on the wall. Look how the picture, and it just little detail. So, being able to straighten the image, that type stuff. So,
no, just have them turn their monitor a little bit.
But, going back to Rogan, going back to Jocko, going back to Andy Stumpf, just looking at and listening to their podcasts and the gear that they had, and then trying to replicate it as closely as possible while still being affordable at my level.
Right.
I knew that I didn't want to do my interviews remotely. I wanted to do them in person. Where this came from, I don't know. I don't know if it's from 30 years of doing interviews, the organicness of being across from somebody. I knew that I wanted to be in person. So
there's a difference.
There is a difference.
Huge difference.
And then anybody who's listened to a podcast that's done remotely, there's certain things you can't control. There's going to be hiccups sometimes with the internet connection. And you're going to get that delay. If you've listened to them sometimes where because of that delay, the person's still talking and they don't know if they've finished. So the guest or the host jumps in and the other ones, and it just kind of ends up stepping on each other.
Right.
So.
Oh, there's a million things.
Yeah.
Jeez, their microphones on their crappy old Dell computer. And there's so many things.
Yes. And so going into it, that was my first logistical issue, was I was going to do all my interviews in person. Then I knew that I don't have any cachet. I can't get the average person to come to me. So I knew that I was going to have to be going to guests. So now I got to find equipment that can travel easily, you know? And so it's just all these little things that you don't think about. And then when you think you've got it all figured out, then like you said, oh, wait a minute. I've got a 40-hour-a-week job. They've got a 40-hour-a-week job, most likely, because I'm talking to people who have gone on to do something else.
Yes, that's the point. Yeah.
You know? And now you've got to work out schedules. And, oh, wait, I'm good on Tuesday well, I can't do Tuesday. You know, and you start playing that game. And then there's the bigger impact is it's going to have an impact on your family. Mm-hmm. You know, I give my wife all the credit in the world because there are many weekends that I screw up because, hey, I can't go do that because I've got this interview scheduled. You know, I've got to go talk to this person or whatever it is that you don't think about. You just think, I'm going to do a podcast. And it sounds so simple. It sounds so ridiculously simple. And you find out that it's not.
It's not. How did your first one go?
My first one actually went well. And the reason I say that, I'll go back to her name's Shiloh. She actually has her own podcast, LA Not So Confidential, okay, where she and her fellow psychologist partner get into true crime stuff. Having somebody who does a podcast.
Oh, she had already done one. It had one.
Yes. And okay, so you're basically just.
You had bumper rails on the.
Yes. Now, I'll say that I organized 3 interviews.
That's smart.
3 interviews in that first weekend. She just happened to be the first one.
In the first weekend?
Yeah, because what I did was I checked into a hotel, you know, I had a living room, and I created the studio. Because again, I knew that I was going to have to go to people.
Yeah, yeah.
But on the same token, I learned that first weekend. So my next guest, John, he was a former Marine, injured Orange County Sheriff's officer who had to retire, and now he had gone on to another career. It taught me the importance of trying to do as much background research on the person, because he literally threw out right at the end of our recording, oh yeah, and I make knives. Like, that would have been something that we could have gone down a rabbit hole and talked about, you know? Because I'm sure there's somebody interested in making knives.
Yeah.
Fortunately, he was a great guest and very helpful to the podcast. So we actually came back and did a second episode where we went deep dive into him making knives, and he actually made a knife that I did as a giveaway through the podcast.
Wow.
But early on, it was reaching out to basically pretty much the majority of people I knew who had gone on to do other things. Like, hey, it wasn't even an ask. It was, I really need you. No, you're going to do this.
Paul needs you bad. Please show up.
I learned the importance of having to edit in that first weekend, because I interviewed my former assistant chief, who's now director of security at a petroleum company, who is legitimately working on the weekends. And so we're doing the interview like we're doing now, and he's got his phone on the desk, and he takes a phone call. He's like, oh, this is work. And then, I thought, okay, and we just kind of kept it going, because he implied that I'll deal with it real quickly. And then it kind of went on. And then it went a little bit longer. And then pretty soon it was a stand up and walk out, you know. And so now I was like, well, do I stop recording or do I just keep it going? So long story short, we just kept it going. And then my editor just cut that out, you know. So
23 minutes.
Yeah. I learned that, you know, I can just, you know. So now when somebody goes, hey, I got to go to the bathroom, just go to the bathroom.
Go ahead.
You know, and I have to go through and tell the editor, hey, cut out here and here.
Yeah. At the 7-minute marks.
You know, I don't do the Joe Rogan. Joe's really good about, he'll do the, hey, I got to go to the bathroom, and then, okay, we're back. You know, I just cut it out and don't even reference to it.
Was it a bit of a difference, like being a cop interrogating or doing investigative work and not trying to be that in the podcast? You're not grilling people, but you're trying to be, you know, you're having a conversation. You're telling stories. You weren't sitting there like, so tell me where you were at 8 o'clock. What were you wearing? Who were you with?
Why is there only one bright light? Yeah. And why is that phone book on the desk?
Well, I'm feeling really uncomfortable.
Why are you turning the heat up so much? So going into it, and I referenced having listened to other podcasts before, and I truly, anybody who wants to listen to Rogan's podcast, he does a great job of just having a conversation with somebody and truly having an interest in. I have used the analogy that I honestly believe that if you took all the recording equipment away, he would still sit across the desk from whoever he's talking to and just have a 2-hour conversation with them, 3-hour conversation, whatever it is. And so I knew going in that I wanted to be genuine about it. And I definitely I wasn't doing this just to, let me just do a podcast. I legitimately wanted to hear their stories. And I knew that I wanted to kind of personalize them a little bit. So don't just assume that, hey, you were in the military, or hey, you were a first responder. To talk about, let's talk about you as a kid. Same way you're kind of like with me. What took you to this?
Right. The path.
Yeah. What brought you to this? And then what was your plan, especially like for military people? Because the one nice thing I would say about the military is they put you in a position to every 4 to 6 years to reevaluate your life. Do you want to keep doing this?
Yeah.
Does this work for you? Because I've had guests.
Are we a good partner together?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've had guests who are, were in for, let's say, varying years. But long story short, they weren't at their 20-year mark to where they could retire.
They weren't, yeah, right.
One of them, his family, as much as he loved being in the military and they were supportive of being in the military, medical reasons forced him to, hey, I got to shut this down at 15 years.
Right.
Another one, I say this, I believe that I've also become friends with all my guests. Another one is Hal Schmidt. He has a winery up in Paso Robles, California. He was a Top Gun pilot and an instructor. And at 17 years, he went, I'm going to go make wine. And it was...
And everybody goes, but you had 3 years. Like,
and if you talk to him, what he'd tell you is they were going to promote me and put me behind a desk. And the idea of sitting behind a desk for the last 3 years was enough for me to go, I know I'm foregoing my retirement, but this is driving me more. I want to go make wine. And the funnier thing is when I sat down to talk to him, he didn't even like wine originally. When he was stationed up at Lemoore, he was the designated driver that was taking his wife and all the friends over to go wine tasting. And then just...
chaperone.
Yes. No interest in wine, wasn't drinking wine. And then one day happened to taste that one bottle of wine. And anybody who's gotten into wine understands that one day when you have that one bottle of wine that goes, oh, this is what wine is. And from there, he was still active in the Navy, and he was making the drive over and talking to the winemakers. Hey, can I help? And it just, like a podcast, like, hey, I'm going to go make wine. And so there have been amazing stories that I've had the opportunity to sit and talk with people who just for whatever reason, their path diverted. And so everybody that I've interviewed has taught me something about myself as an interviewer, taught me something about how to try to be better at the podcast. But for the most part, there truly is a genuine passion and an interest by me to hear people's stories. And as I told you before we started recording, I'm a year and a half into it now, and I'm at a point where I couldn't stop today if you told me I had to.
If I won the lotto, I'm still doing this.
Yes. And it takes a lot of time. It eats up a lot of time of my family. It puts my family in awkward positions. It's a strain on them because, okay, maybe I'm doing a podcast interview. I'm started doing more and more of them here at the house. And not only now do they have to be mindful of the time, but now they got to be quiet. You're trying to limit so it's like all of a sudden you got to turn into a church mouse while I'm recording an episode. Right. I've taken my wife with me where she's been in the adjacent room of the hotel and now bored out of her gourd.
She's trapped for 3 hours.
Yes, because yes, she's interested in the stories, but
she'd like to walk out of the room and go to the pool.
Or she's not part of the conversation. Right. So how, because for the most part, she listens to the podcast.
Yeah.
She tends to listen to them when she's working out. So it's like, she doesn't necessarily want to listen to it while it's being recorded. So there's all of these external influences that you didn't realize it. But at the end of the day, for me, it was the importance of meeting somebody and allowing them to present their story. I would love to talk to people who we'll put it in the parameters of per society or per anybody looking at it, they made bad decisions in their careers. And the fact that they didn't let that mistake define them. I just had an episode out last week with a young woman who was in the Marine Corps and was basically asked to leave because she failed a drug test. I'm not there to judge her. It's not my job to judge her actions. It's my job to be empathetic and sympathetic and ask her those questions that if somebody else was in her exact same shoes, she's able to be that voice of reason and wisdom to say, hey, maybe don't do this.
Yeah.
Maybe do this instead.
Yeah. Let me tell you my path. And if it helps you out and gives you some advice, that's it. Because I listened to that one and you could have jumped on her and been like, well, what do you mean you knew you're in Colombia? There's all kinds of stuff in the tea or the water. You don't drink out of anything that doesn't have a lid on it. That's not where you're at that point. You're letting her tell her story for advice for hopefully somebody else.
And for me, what adds to that is the fact that she wasn't making any excuses for her actions.
She owned it.
She took full responsibility. That to me is the bigger component of it.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to come on as a guest and I haven't had this experience yet, but they want to start going down it's everybody else's fault.
Woe was me, but that's their fault. Yeah.
Then you may get more of the cop in me kind of come out and wait a minute. Yeah. Wait a minute. But
who still has a Yellow Pages?
I was talking about that the other day with somebody. How many kids don't get to use Yellow Pages anymore as a booster chair because there are no Yellow Pages?
Right. Not a clue. There's a lot of kids that just don't know.
But that was my thing is that people are going to make mistakes. They're going to do stuff in their careers that doesn't necessarily fall into what is considered appropriate. As long as you're willing to take ownership of it, hey. Now, on the flip side, would I love to have stories where everything was peachy keen and this? I'm sure I'm going to have those. But the two things that I definitely wanted from the get-go is I wanted people, for those who had their career taken from them, to talk about because I've also had guests who, a young guy who was fit, SWAT, the whole 9 yards, and all of a sudden he's getting panic attacks, or what he thought was panic attacks. He's going out on an operation and his heart's just racing through his vest, going, what the hell's going on? And he goes to the doctor and the doctor's like, oh, you just had a panic attack. Well, what caused it? Kind of deal. And so it was the going on, the pushing forward. And finally that one doctor that said, let's run this test, and found out that it's a genetic defect in his heart. And it's ARVC. I'm going to destroy the technical name for it. But Brent Hughes, you can go back and listen to his episode. This guy was the picture of fitness, CrossFit, the whole 9 yards. This doctor finally tells him it's a genetic defect with your heart. And guess what the worst thing to do is? Be physically fit and physically active. It is the one thing that creates the deterioration of your heart quicker. So, hey, not only can you no longer be a cop, but now you have to limit your physical activity.
You got to put your ass on a couch?
Not to that extreme, but like going for a run, going out and doing a hard CrossFit workout, doing anything that adds
very moderate work. Yeah, you got to.
He plays golf.
Yeah.
And fortunately, his kids are great golfers, so he's almost turned into like a professional caddy. But it was something
interesting.
And all he ever wanted to do was be a cop. And now it literally, the rug was just pulled right out from underneath him.
Have you had stories that are just mind blowing? Just like, and it's be only a year and a half, but some you're just like, whoa, I'm glad we met.
Yes. I'll go back to there's quite a few of them that stand out to me. So I mentioned to you the MARSOC Marine that retired and was dealing with the trauma. And during our interview, he mentioned that at his worst, he had one of his nights where he sat up, night terrors, that whole 9 yards, and was right on the verge of committing suicide. And he mentioned how his wife, laying in bed next to him, put her hand on his shoulder, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but basically, I got you. And anybody who's operated in a team environment in the military or first responder knows the importance of that tap up and having that person on your back. And in that moment, I remember saying to myself, all right, I need to bring on some spouses to let them give their perspective of what they saw in their spouse and how they helped them through. So I just randomly asked him, hey, think your wife would want to be on this? And I didn't really know much about his wife. And he goes, yeah, I'm sure she probably would. Well, it turns out his wife was a retired chief warrant officer in the Marine Corps also. But better than that is we sit down to start talking, and she was born in Afghanistan, escaped Afghanistan as a 5-year-old with her parents, came to this country, grows up in a very strict religious Muslim household here in Southern California. At 18 years old is basically kind of shown the roadmap of her future. Like, we'll let you go to college, but you understand your role is to be, subservient wife. We're going to arrange the marriage for, and she goes, no, that doesn't work for me. And her answer was, I'm going to go join the Marine Corps. And she makes a career out of it, becomes a warrant officer, gets redeployed or gets deployed to Afghanistan, and now has the experience of being the leader of a team dealing with these very sexist Afghani nationals. And when they go, we want to talk to who's in charge, and her going, not only am I the one in charge, these 6-foot-tall Marines behind me all answer to me. So it was that kind of like, that part of the story I just never expected. Obviously, I've met some people when we record this. So it's a Sunday. Tomorrow's episode is going to be with Nick Lavery. He is a active duty Army Green Beret who completely lost almost all of his leg in an ambush attack and fought through and redeployed with a completely prosthetic leg at the Special Forces level. I've had a retired Navy SEAL who had his hand blown off and redeployed with, an attachment.
Right.
So meeting people who have that will not quit mentality has been amazing. But then there's others that I've met that, I mentioned his name is Benji Manabog. He was in the Marine Corps for 15 years, MARSOC, hard charger. His wife has a significant medical problem, and it was, I need to go home and be with my family. As much as I'm having fun doing this, I need to go back and be with my family. But the one common thing that runs through all of it too is a lot of these people, you talked about, Jess and her being asked to leave the Marine Corps. What is her business today? Giving back to veterans. She's created a veteran travel business. So even though they had to leave the military or leave the first responder community, they're doing what they can to be an ally and a resource giving back to the first responder and veteran communities.
Have you had any guests just come reach back out to you and say thank you?
Yes. I've received it from guests who they'll tell me, hey, I didn't realize I was going to open up to you as much as I did. So that's a compliment to me as an interviewer. I've had people reach back and say, hey, a friend of mine listened to my episode. They didn't know what I'd gone through, and now they're going to go get some help. Again, those things that just say, if for nothing else, I will keep doing this podcast. Because the way I look at it is, if by me doing my podcast, one person does something that they may not have done because my podcast wasn't there, then that's all the validation that I need. But I've also, I was just at a training conference up in Oxnard, and just someone randomly, of course I'm, advertising the podcast because I'm walking around with my hoodie that says Transition to a Podcast, but just, someone coming up to me, tapping my shoulder, like, hey, I listened to your podcast. What you're doing is great. That's what drives me.
Yeah, that's fantastic when that happens. What's your process? Like, are you doing a lot of research on your guests, or do you kind of want it to be a little organic so you're not like listening to every podcast maybe they've been on previously or read their whole book? What's your kind of walkthrough on that?
If they've written a book, I always read the book. With every guest that I've interviewed who's written a book, I've read the book before I sat down to talk to them. Because again, it's that trying to be authentic and sincere, but there's stuff that they write in their books that even if they've been on other podcasts, there's going to be little nuggets in there that you can pull from to aid your conversation. The other thing is, I've listened to podcasts where the host has glossed over the book that they read. That's a huge commitment for somebody to take the time to write a book and put themselves out there. You know, for most people who are writing a book, they're putting out some usually pretty personal stuff. And so I want to honor that by at least being able to say, yeah, I remember in this chapter or something. I may not remember every single aspect, but I'm pulling stuff out of it.
Does it help a little bit that you're in the community?
Oh, I think so.
You know, if I'm not going to pick on anybody, but let's say, podcast A, that guy's just, a podcast or whatever he is, and he's not obviously doing what you're doing. So you can just go like, hey, I've been there. I've had that late shift. Shit goes sideways. I got it.
100%. 100%. It definitely helps to relate. Now, the one thing I will say is I purposely don't make, for anybody who's listened to the podcast, I really don't go down the raw war stories route, because the goal of the podcast is more about talking about the transition. Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned having interviewed one of the LAPD guys. So for anybody who remembers the incident, and at the very end, the 3 SWAT guys that rolled in that engaged in the car-to-car shootout with the suspect, I got to interview one of those 3 guys. And of course, that specific moment in time for law enforcement is very pivotal. Yeah. So we talked about that. And I talked about it more from a joking perspective, because if you remember, one of the guys is actually in shorts.
Yes.
And what it turns out, the 3 of them were up at the academy getting ready to go for a run. Then they just jumped in their car and rolled down to it. But I've talked to the captain who was the on-duty SWAT commander when the Route 91 shooting happened. That is a very poignant moment for law enforcement. I've talked to one of the sergeants who was in charge of one of the REACT teams for that. So in that sense, they're very poignant moments. Yes, I will go into that specific event. But generally speaking, I try not to make it, for like if I'm talking to a military guy. So tell me about that first deployment. What was it like killing your first person? Yeah. There are plenty of other podcasts, and there's some great ones that walk people through that. If that's what you're looking for, you'll find it. For me, I hit on the fact of what took you there, how'd you like it while you were there, what was your plan, kind of deal. If it's a specific event, like with Nick Lavery and losing his leg, I'll talk about that. But where I was more focused was the afterwards. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your mindset. What advice do you give to somebody maybe going through this? Because, there is a part of, and I've had multiple guests now who have been injured in the line of duty, whether it be first responder or military. And some of them lost their career, and they didn't know where to turn and what resources they had. They basically were told, hey, like I said, you're now a liability on our line item. We're going to ask you to leave. Whereas the people who were able to fight back, what steps did they take? Who should they be reaching out to get their allies in place to try to get back to full duty? Because I think a lot of times people have the mindset to say, I can still do this job. Yeah. Just give me the opportunity and work with me.
If somebody listens to this podcast or knows somebody, how could they reach you about being a guest on your podcast?
I have a website, transitiondrillpodcast.com. There's a contact me page. I'm on all of the social media, so Twitter, Instagram at Paul Pantani. You can reach out to me that way. But the easiest way is just go to my website, Transition Drill Podcast. Shoot me contact the host and send me your information.
Yeah, I'd be great to be on. Have me on. If, like we said, if we both won the lotto, which I have to play to win, so that's always my problem, I'd still be doing this. Is this something where
that goes back to my cop days of the people who got the Canadian lottery letter, and they're like, "But it says I won." When did you play the Canadian lottery?
I did it, I guess. Shocking. If you're seeing yourself in 5 years, is the podcast evolving in any way, or do you see yourself still kind of with this kind of path?
So yes, podcast is going to evolve. I want to from the video aspect. I want to take it to that 2-camera setup. So when someone's watching it, when the guest is talking, they're the primary focus on camera. The Joe Rogan effect.
Right.
That is in my plans. A dedicated studio where I'm not sitting in my garage, with a makeshift studio. That's at the basic level. Obviously, I always want the podcast to grow. If there's ever the opportunity to any way enhance the audio, enhance the video, I want to give the listener and the viewer the best experience they can get. From a personal standpoint, my podcast is called Transition Drill. There's going to come a point where once I feel like I've established it, I might want to have I'll use you as an example. Somebody who doesn't have a connection to the military or law enforcement, I just want to do the Joe Rogan thing and have a conversation with you because it's an interest to me. Mm-hmm. I definitely see that down the road. There's going to be a point where we all meet people in our lives that are just interesting. You go to a dinner party with your wife or your husband, and all of a sudden you just spent the last hour and a half talking to some guy he's an accountant.
Right.
But for whatever reason, he said something that was interesting to you.
That's the forensic side in you.
Probably.
Nobody finds accountant interesting. You were just being kind. That was your Catholic school board.
Carry the 1, put the 4 in that category.
Tell me about your Excel spreadsheet.
Your debts to what's your God, I don't even know the terminology, but basically what you owe and what you have, it doesn't equal out, and you're losing money. And
but yeah, you're right. You do want to. You could path and find a bigger audience and talk to bigger, greater people, because we walk amongst people with stories all the time, and people. It's the best part when you get to hear them. That's the best part of this job.
It really, truly is.
And I don't even call it a job.
It's. I don't look at it
My
as a job.
My wife does, maybe. My accountant probably does.
Again, not to overplay it, but it's kind of like you said earlier about going into law enforcement. It's a calling. There are so many people every day that start podcasts, and it's great. I think that I'm sounding like a broken record here. One of the things that you can definitely credit to Joe Rogan is the exchange of information in a long form content. Mm-hmm. The impact that podcast and podcasters are having on the general media is huge.
Yeah.
Because they've been in a pattern or a plan of the last 70 years, whatever it is, of 2 to 3 minute sound bites. And
right.
You listen to guests who have been on these popular news channels or whatever, and they'll even say, I wanted to say this, but I just didn't have the time. Mm-hmm. And so podcasters are getting the general public access to so much more information. So from an altruistic standpoint, more podcasts, the merrier. That being said, don't get into this if all you want to do is it's kind of like the same thing. I'll use the analogy of young people who want to become social media influencers. They just want to do it for the number of followers, not necessarily that their content is what drives them.
Right.
If you're going to get into a podcast, get into it. And like we've mentioned, do it because if nobody listened to your episode, you would still want to do it.
Right. Yeah.
If that's any advice that I could give, and anytime somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm thinking about, do it. Yeah, because the thing is, if you go into it for the right reasons and you go into it with your heart in it to want to give back, every one of us has something a little bit different that we can give to a segment of our population that's going to be interesting. Whatever it is, it may be, and if you go down this rabbit hole of researching podcasts, they'll tell you, if you're talking about a topic that only interests 10 people in the world, but all 10 people listen to your podcast, then you have the best percentage of listeners of any podcast there is. That's great in thought and in basics, but at the end of the day, your goal is to try to grow and hit as many people as possible. But what I'm saying is that have an idea of what information you want to put out there and target that information to who you want to listen to it. But when you present that information, even if it's a solo podcast, put out information that you feel is truly important, not try to just pull on what's popular at the time. because all you're going to do is you're going to get a guest, or you're going to get a listener who listens today, but they're not going to listen tomorrow because the next information you have doesn't fall in line with what they want.
Right. Final question, most important. This is the most important question. Would you give up your law enforcement career, all the wonderful moments of your career, to have spent one season playing as a Dodger?
Wow. What year am I playing in?
Any one you want. 88,
81,
81,
57,
57, yeah.
No.
2009 with Manny? No?
No. I've had, and I'm not, I mean, there are men and women who I've had the opportunity to work with and be around that have done far more than I will ever do in my career.
But it's your career, so that's what matters.
It's my career.
Yeah.
But like I said earlier, in now almost 31 years of just of being a sworn police officer, 35 almost total, there's never been a point that I didn't like this job, that I didn't enjoy what I was doing, and that I ever thought that I'd rather be doing something else.
Boy, the Dodgers missed out on a good man.
No, they didn't. I've got zero talent.
Paul, thank you so much. I'm glad we got to meet up and do this. The podcast that you're doing, it's got a lot of wealth to it. It means a lot when you get to hear these people's stories and how their lives are being affected in the right way, and they're moving on and they're doing great things, especially with first responders who, yes, that's a term that's new, that was not used when you and I were kids, that you're shining a good light on these people. These people have a lot of great knowledge to drop. And so your podcast means a lot, and it's great that you're doing it.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I wish you the continued success on yours. I've listened to several of your episodes, and I'll maybe kind of pigeonhole you. You like talking to photographers, but I think that that's where your interest is. But you've also had some great conversations with sports people. And so I find value in what you're doing also. So it's been a pleasure to be a guest on your podcast.
Yeah, we're having the time of our lives, man.
That is true.
Now, if we could just get our wives to agree on it and our accountants to actually help us out, we'd be doing fine.
I would like to even be able to say that I have an accountant.
Well, what we need major sponsors. So if Home Depot or Pepsi or Taco Bell or whatever, even the Dodgers would like to sponsor our podcast, please reach out to Paul or Matt at their following email addresses.
We won't turn you away. Hey, why's Pup and Taco want to sponsor me?
I'll wear the shirt. I don't care. I'll wear all orange if Home Depot wants to sponsor this podcast.
And have buckets all over the place.
Right. I'll be handing out buckets to guests and those little orange aprons and the little paint sticks. I'll be giving it all the way. I don't care.
Again, my pleasure being here.
All right. You're the best. Thanks, man. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Paul Pantani. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and become a subscriber to the podcast. Remember, you can follow the Just a Good Conversation podcast on Instagram, and you can find all of our past shows on the website at justagoodconversation.com. Thank you for listening.